What if the real foundation of ancient empires was not conquest but paperwork? Ancient history is often told through battles, kings, and monumental architecture, but the true engines of power were the forgotten bureaucracies that made those empires function. By the end of this video, you will see how scribes, inspectors, and tax collectors held civilizations together for centuries, often more influential than any general. How did Sumerian city-states manage their grain without a single computer? Why did the Inca rely on knotted cords instead of written records? These mysteries survive in lost archives and overlooked officials, revealing a sophistication we rarely associate with the ancient world. What comes to mind when you think of the unseen workforce behind history's greatest achievements? The towering statues of pharaohs and the bronze swords of legionaries dominate our mental image of ancient power. Kings claimed glory, generals won battles, and great walls rose against enemies. Yet this picture leaves out the quiet machinery that kept those civilizations alive through droughts, rebellions, and centuries of change. Without a system to count grain, track labor, and enforce laws, even the mightiest army would starve within weeks. The real strength of any empire lay not in its weapons but in its records, its inspectors, and its invisible network of officials who turned conquest into lasting order. Consider the first great cities of Mesopotamia, where clay tokens and sealed tablets recorded every sack of barley, or the Inca, who managed a vast mountain realm without a single written word, relying instead on colored cords and trained specialists who could read them like a book. These systems were so sophisticated that historians still debate how they functioned without fraud or collapse. The people who operated them rarely left statues or grand tombs. Their names are lost, but their work shaped the daily lives of millions. So where do we begin uncovering this hidden skeleton of empire? Let us travel back nearly 5,000 years to the banks of the Tigris and Euphrates, where a humble clay tablet holds the secret to how a few city-states grew into the world's first empire. The first bureaucrats did not carry swords or wear crowns. They sat cross-legged on dusty floors, holding a wedge-shaped reed stylus over a lump of wet clay. Their tools were simple, but their power was immense. In the city-states of Sumer, around 3,200 years before the Common Era, a new class of specialists emerged who would quietly invent the machinery of administration. They were the scribes, and their work began with a problem that every growing community faces: how to keep track of what you have, what you owe, and who is responsible. The earliest clay tablets were not poems or royal decrees. They were receipts. A farmer delivers barley to a temple storehouse. A potter supplies 50 jars for a festival. A shepherd hands over a quota of wool. Each transaction needed a record, a permanent mark that could be checked later if a dispute arose. At first, people used simple clay tokens shaped like animals or grain measures, stored inside hollow clay balls called bulli. To know what was inside, they pressed the tokens onto the surface of the ball before sealing it. Over time, they realized that the impressions alone were enough. Why carry the tokens at all? That insight gave birth to writing. The scribe class arose to handle this new technology. It was not a job anyone could take up. Becoming a scribe required years of training in a special school called an adaba, a tablet house. Students copied lists of signs, practiced counting grain, and memorized complex tables of weights and measures. They learned to press wedges into clay with exact pressure and angle, because a single mistake could change a number and ruin a harvest record. The work was tedious, repetitive, and absolutely vital. Without accurate records, taxes could not be collected, wages could not be paid, and the entire economy would stumble. Think of the modern world without spreadsheets or receipts. That was the challenge facing ancient Sumer. As cities swelled to tens of thousands of people, the old system of memory and trust broke down. You could not expect a farmer to remember exactly how much grain he delivered last season, especially when the temple was feeding thousands of workers. You needed a third party, a neutral record keeper who wrote down the facts in a language of signs that everyone agreed upon. That third party was the scribe. And because the scribe controlled the information, the scribe controlled the city. The scribes did not just record grain and livestock. They inventoried tools, tracked labor gangs, and even kept lists of workers who were sick or absent. One tablet from the ancient city of Lagash records a group of brewery workers, listing how much beer each person received as a daily ration. Another tablet details a delivery of fish to a temple kitchen. These are not grand documents of conquest. They are the mundane, everyday records that made empire possible. Without them, a ruler could not know how many soldiers he could feed, how many bricks he could demand for a wall, or how much tribute a province owed. The scribble class became a separate layer of society. They were not nobles, but they were not common laborers either. Their skill gave them access to the inner workings of power. They sat in the courts of kings, advising on resource allocation. They traveled with armies, counting spoils and prisoners. They served as diplomats, writing letters in multiple languages. In many ways, they were the first civil servants, and their work created a feedback loop of efficiency. The more records you kept, the more you could plan. The more you planned, the larger your empire could grow. But this system had a hidden cost. The scribes were loyal to the institution, not to the people. Their records could be used to squeeze more taxes from a struggling farmer or to deny a worker his wages if the tablet was lost. Bureaucracy, from its very beginning, carried both the power to organize and the power to oppress. And yet, without it, the great cities of Mesopotamia would have collapsed into chaos. The scribes were the invisible thread that held the fabric of civilization together. Archaeologists have dug up tens of thousands of these clay tablets, many no bigger than a hand. They survive because clay does not rot. When a building burned down, the tablets were baked even harder, preserving the records of daily life for thousands of years. So when we hold a tablet today, we are holding the actual work of an ancient bureaucrat. We see a list of barley deliveries, a contract for a house, a court case about a faulty copper tool. These are the forgotten voices of administration, and from this Mesopotamian beginning, the idea of organized record-keeping spread across the ancient world, adapting to every culture it touched. Inside the mud brick walls of Ur, a scribe pressed a reed into wet clay. This simple act, repeated thousands of times each day, created the world's first permanent record-keeping system. The tablets were small, often small enough to fit in one hand, but they carried the weight of an entire civilization. On them, a scribe would record every bushel of barley that entered the temple granaries, every worker assigned to a canal-digging crew, and every shipment of copper traded from distant mountains. These were not just notes, they were the binding agreements that made city life possible. The system grew out of necessity. In a city like Lagash, which housed tens of thousands of people, the economy depended on accurate tracking. Grain was the backbone of life. It was grown, harvested, transported, stored, and distributed as rations to workers. Without records, a single miscalculation could mean famine or unrest. The temple administrators needed to know exactly how much grain was in each silo, how much had been given out, and how much remained for the next season. So scribes developed a detailed notation. They marked the type of grain, the quantity using a base 60 number system, the date, and the name of the official responsible. A broken tablet could lead to a shortage, so copies were made and stored in separate rooms. Labor drafts were another critical area. When the king of Ur decided to build a new ziggurat, he did not simply command workers to appear. The scribes first calculated how many laborers were needed, how long the project would take, and how much food they would require each day. Then they dispatched messengers to villages with quotas. Each village had to send a certain number of men for a set period. The scribes recorded who showed up, who was sick, and who tried to escape duty. They even tracked the amount of beer and bread given to each worker as payment. These records were stored in the temple archive, where they could be consulted years later if a dispute arose. Trade ledgers reached even further. Sumerian merchants sailed to the Indus Valley and the coast of Oman, bringing back timber, stone, and precious metals. Every transaction was recorded on a tablet, signed by witnesses, and sealed with a cylinder rolled across the clay. The seal was a personal signature, unique to each merchant or official. If a shipment of lapis lazuli went missing, the scribe could trace the chain of custody back to the original seller. This level of accountability allowed trade to flourish over vast distances, connecting city-states into a network of economic interdependence. Becoming a scribe required years of training in a special school called the Adaba, or tablet house. Students began by copying simple lists of signs, then progressed to complex mathematical problems and legal formulas. They practiced writing on small clay discs before moving to full-sized tablets. Discipline was strict. One surviving text records a student being beaten for talking in class, another for leaving his tablet dirty. The goal was to produce a professional who could write with speed and accuracy, because mistakes in a grain count could cost lives. Graduates emerged as members of a powerful elite. They did not farm or fight. They held the keys to the city's memory. This bureaucracy directly enabled the rise of great city-states. With its towering ziggurat and bustling harbor, could not have functioned without an army of scribes organizing its resources. Lagash, which fought bitter border wars with its neighbor Umma, relied on scribes to document land ownership and justify territorial claims. The written word became a weapon as much as a tool. A king who controlled the archives controlled the past. He could rewrite history, adjust tax records, or erase the name of a rival from official documents. The scribes stood at the center of this power. They advised the ruler, managed the economy, and sometimes even served as judges in legal disputes. Yet today, these scribes are almost completely forgotten. Their names rarely appear in history books. Their faces are not carved on monuments. We know them only through the tens of thousands of tablets they left behind. Those tablets reveal a world where a man with a stylus was as influential as any priest or general. The next time you see a photograph of an ancient clay tablet, remember that you are looking at the work of a forgotten bureaucrat who helped hold an empire together. And as we move forward in time, we will see how other cultures took this idea of record-keeping and transformed it into something even more remarkable. The Nile Valley had its own solution to the problem of running a kingdom. While Sumerian scribes pressed reeds into clay, Egyptian officials carved hieroglyphs into stone and wrote on papyrus scrolls that stretched for feet. At the top of this administrative pyramid stood a single figure whose power rivaled that of the pharaoh himself, the vizier. In ancient Egypt, the vizier was not just a minister or a counselor. He was the chief operating officer of the entire state, responsible for everything from the harvest to the courts to the construction of monuments. Every major decision passed through his office. He appointed local governors, managed the treasury, supervised irrigation projects, and even served as the highest judge in the land. The pharaoh, seen as a living god, needed a mortal hand to translate divine commands into practical action. That mortal hand was the vizier. The office was so critical that it often became hereditary. A father would train his son from childhood in the arts of administration, passing down secret knowledge of tax rates, land boundaries, and diplomatic protocols. The vizier's day began before sunrise. He would wash, dress in a white linen robe, and take his seat in the Hall of the Two Truths, where he heard petitions from nobles and commoners alike. He had to listen carefully because justice was seen as the foundation of cosmic order called Mot. A vizier who ruled unfairly could bring chaos upon the land. One surviving instruction manual for viziers, carved into the tomb of a man named Rickmeyer, lays out the ethics of the job. It warns the vizier not to show favoritism to the rich, not to accept bribes, and to treat the poor with the same respect as the powerful. The bureaucracy under the vizier was vast and deeply layered. Egypt was divided into 42 provinces called nomes, each governed by a nomarch who answered directly to the vizier. These nomarchs managed local courts, granaries, and workforces. They collected taxes in the form of grain, cattle, and goods, then sent reports and shipments to the central treasury. The flow of information was constant. Messengers traveled along the Nile on swift boats, carrying papyrus scrolls sealed with clay stamped by the vizier's own cylinder seal. A single misplaced document could delay an entire season's harvest count. The vizier also controlled the state workforce, which built the pyramids, temples, and irrigation canals. This was not a system of slave labor as often depicted. Historical research suggests that most pyramid builders were farmers who worked during the flood season when fields were underwater. They were organized into crews of skilled laborers, fed from state granaries, and housed in planned villages near the construction sites. The vizier's office kept meticulous records of every worker's attendance, rations, and sick days. One papyrus from the reign of Ramesses III records a labor dispute where workers went on strike because their grain rations were late. The vizier at the time had to personally negotiate with the strikers, promising to deliver the overdue supplies. This shows that even the most powerful bureaucrat could not ignore the needs of the people without consequences. The vizier was also the keeper of the royal archives. Every decree, treaty, and tax record was stored in a building called the House of Life, attached to major temples. Scribes copied documents carefully, preserving the state's memory across generations. When a new pharaoh ascended the throne, the vizier presented a summary of the kingdom's resources, including the size of the army, the state of the treasury, and the condition of the irrigation network. This briefing allowed the new ruler to begin governing without delay. Some viziers became so influential that they overshadowed the pharaohs they served. One of the most famous is Imhotep, who served as vizier to King Djoser around 2600 years before the Common Era. Imhotep was not only an administrator but also an architect, a physician, and a priest. He designed the step pyramid at Saqqara, the first large stone building in history. His success elevated him to legendary status. Centuries after his death, he was worshipped as a god of wisdom and medicine. But even lesser-known viziers held immense sway. They advised on foreign policy, decided which temples received funding, and controlled the distribution of land after the annual Nile flood erased property boundaries. The vizier's power came from knowledge. He knew where every grain of wheat was stored, every worker assigned, and every tax owed. In a land where the river dictated the rhythm of life, the vizier was the steady hand that kept the kingdom balanced. Without him, the pharaoh would be like a ship without a rudder, drifting on the current of fortune. Yet like the Sumerian scribes, most viziers are forgotten today. Their names survive only in tombs and papyrus fragments, buried under centuries of sand. Their quiet work of counting, organizing, and judging made Egypt one of the longest-lasting civilizations in human history. And as we look further east, a very different kind of bureaucracy was taking shape, one that would stand out among ancient empires for its merit-based officials and written examinations. One of the most revealing voices from ancient Egypt belongs to a vizier named Ptahhotep. He served during the 5th dynasty, around 2400 years before the Common Era, under Pharaoh Djedkar-Isi. Ptahhotep left behind a collection of teachings known as the Maxims of Tahutup, a text that was copied and studied for centuries after his death. This document is not a royal decree or a military chronicle. It is a guide for how to be a good official, a kind of ancient leadership manual written by a seasoned bureaucrat. Ptahhotep understood that the vizier's power came from knowledge, but also from character. He wrote that a true leader listens patiently, speaks only after careful thought, and avoids arrogance. He warned against greed because a corrupt official would eventually bring ruin upon the whole kingdom. One maxim says, "Do not be proud of your knowledge. Consult the ignorant and the wise alike, for the limits of wisdom are never set." This reveals a deep awareness that bureaucracy, if left unchecked by ethics, could become a tool of oppression. Ptahhotep believed that justice was not just a virtue but a practical necessity. When a vizier treated the poor with fairness, the people trusted the state, and the state remained stable. The office he held was the invisible pillar of the Old Kingdom, the period of pyramid building and centralized power that lasted for roughly 500 years. Without the discipline and moral guidance passed down through texts like his, the vast machinery of grain collection, tax assessment, and labor management would have crumbled under its own weight. Ptahhotep's voice, preserved on papyrus and copied by generations of scribes, reminds us that ancient bureaucracies were not soulless machines. They were human institutions shaped by the values of the people who ran them. The Hittites turned diplomacy into a precise bureaucratic art, and their treaties survive as some of the earliest written agreements between nations. Around 1600 years before the Common Era, the Hittite Empire rose in what is now Turkey, a land of rugged mountains and fertile plains. Unlike the centralized kingdoms of Mesopotamia or Egypt, the Hittite realm was a patchwork of conquered territories, client states, and rival powers. Holding it together required more than military force. It required a system of written promises, carefully recorded and archived for future reference. The Hittite diplomatic corps was not a formal academy or a single office. It was a network of scribes, envoys, and officials trained in the language of treaties. They wrote in Akkadian, the common tongue of ancient diplomacy, on clay tablets that were then baked and stored in the royal capital of Hattusa. These tablets are not simple lists of terms. They are elaborate documents that invoke gods, describe historical events, and outline mutual obligations. The Hittites understood that a treaty was not just a contract but a sacred bond. Breaking it meant angering the deities who witnessed it. One of the most famous examples is the Treaty of Kadesh, signed around 1259 before the Common Era between the Hittite king Hattusa III and the Egyptian pharaoh Ramesses II. This treaty ended decades of conflict over control of the Syrian city of Kadesh. Both sides sent copies to their capitals, and portions of it are still visible on the walls of the Karnak temple in Egypt. The treaty includes clauses about extradition, mutual defense, and the repatriation of refugees. It even contains a curse on any ruler who violates its terms and a blessing on those who uphold it. This was not a vague agreement. It was a precise legal document negotiated by professional diplomats and inscribed by skilled scribes. The bureaucratic machinery behind these treaties was immense. Before any treaty was signed, Hittite officials gathered intelligence about the other kingdom. They studied its military strength, its alliances, and its recent history. Then they drafted a proposal that balanced the interests of both sides. The king of the Hittites often gave personal approval, but the actual work fell to a class of officials known as the Lords of the Treaty. These men traveled with armed escorts, carried sealed tablets, and followed strict protocols for greeting foreign rulers. They had to memorize key passages and sometimes perform rituals to seal the agreement, such as sacrificing a sheep or pouring libations. Once signed, the treaty was not simply filed away. Copies were placed in temples under the watch of the gods, and local governors in border regions received summaries. Hittite records show that officials regularly reviewed treaty terms and sent reports to the capital about compliance. If a client king failed to send tribute or allowed raiders to cross his land, the Hittite bureaucracy would dispatch a warning, then a second warning, and finally a military response. This systematic enforcement prevented small violations from escalating into full-scale war. The Hittite approach to bureaucracy through treaties was a form of soft power. By locking allies into written agreements, the Hittites extended their influence without stationing armies everywhere. Their empire lasted for nearly 5 centuries, and part of that longevity came from their skill in turning enemies into partners through legal language. The tablets found at Hattusa, numbering over 30,000, include not only treaties but also diplomatic letters, court records, and administrative accounts. They reveal a civilization that valued order and predictability, even in its most dangerous relationships. Today, these clay fragments give us a window into a world where a scribe sitting in a dusty archive could shape the fate of nations. The Hittite diplomatic corps may not have built pyramids or conquered vast lands, but they created a legacy of peaceful resolution that influenced later empires, including the Persians and the Romans. Their treaties were a bureaucracy of trust, backed by the threat of divine punishment, and when that trust failed, the records remained, reminding future generations of promises made and broken. Hittite rulers governed through treaties, not just armies. This shift in emphasis from raw force to written agreement marked a profound evolution in how an empire could extend its reach. While Egyptian viziers managed a centralized kingdom from a single court, the Hittite world was a sprawling mosaic of diverse peoples, conquered states, and uneasy allies. To hold this patchwork together, they developed a bureaucratic system that placed the written word at the heart of international relations. The capital city of Hattusa, located in the rugged highlands of central Anatolia, became a vast repository of this diplomatic machinery. Within its fortified walls, scribes worked in dedicated archives, pressing cuneiform signs into clay tablets that recorded everything from royal decrees to the minutiae of trade agreements. The discovery of these archives in the early 20th century by German archaeologists was a revelation that reshaped our understanding of ancient statecraft. Tens of thousands of tablets emerged from the rubble of burned buildings, baked hard by the very fires that destroyed the city. Among them were not just economic records or temple inventories, but a treasure trove of international law, treaties, letters, and legal codes that demonstrated a level of diplomatic sophistication previously unsuspected for the Bronze Age. The most famous of these documents is the Treaty of Kadesh, signed around 1259 before the Common Era between the Hittite king Hattusili III and the Egyptian pharaoh Rameses II. This was not a simple ceasefire. It was a comprehensive agreement that established a formal alliance, defined borders, promised mutual military support, and even included provisions for the extradition of refugees. Both sides inscribed copies, and the Egyptian version was carved onto the walls of the Karnak temple, ensuring its public display for centuries. But the Hittite copy, buried in the archives of Hattusa, reveals the internal workings of the negotiation. The tablet includes not only the final treaty text but also the oath sworn before the gods, the list of divine witnesses, and the curses that would fall upon any who broke the pact. This level of detail shows that the Hittite bureaucracy treated diplomacy as a sacred legal process, not a casual exchange of favors. The scribes who produced these documents were highly trained specialists. They mastered multiple languages, including Akkadian, the lingua franca of the ancient Near East, as well as Hittite and sometimes Hurrian. They understood the nuances of legal phrasing and knew how to craft clauses that balanced the interests of both parties. Their work was as crucial as any general's campaign. Without a properly drafted treaty, a military victory could dissolve into endless border raids and broken promises. The archives at Hattusa contain drafts, corrections, and copies of correspondence between Hittite kings and their vassal rulers in Syria and Anatolia. One letter might reprimand a local governor for failing to send tribute on time. Another might thank a client king for providing troops for a campaign. This back and forth reveals a system of constant surveillance and gentle pressure, with the written word serving as a tool of control that did not require an army at every gate. The Hittite legal code found in these archives is another testament to their administrative order. It laid out punishments for theft, assault, and property damage, but it also included rules for marriage, inheritance, and the treatment of slaves. The code was not static. It was revised over time with annotations showing changes made by later kings. This flexibility suggests a bureaucracy that was responsive to social and economic realities, not merely a rigid set of commands handed down from the throne. The entire system relied on an extensive network of messengers and local officials who ensured that tablets traveled safely across the rugged terrain. A treaty signed in Hattusa had to be communicated to every border fortress and vassal court. The bureaucracy ensured that copies were distributed and that local leaders understood their obligations. When a vassal failed to comply, the archives show a series of escalating warnings, from a polite reminder to a formal demand backed by the threat of divine punishment. Only after repeated violations did the Hittite king dispatch troops. The written record acted as a buffer, giving diplomacy a chance to work before swords were drawn. What these tablets reveal is a forgotten administrative sophistication that challenges the old image of ancient empires as purely brutal and chaotic. The Hittites understood that power was not just about how many soldiers you could field, but how effectively you could manage relationships. Their archives are a window into a world where a scribe, sitting with a stylus in a dimly lit room, could shape the fate of nations by choosing the right words. And when we hold those tablets today, we are reading the actual conversations of rulers who lived 3,000 years ago, their hopes, their warnings, and their attempts to build a stable order on a foundation of written promises. The Assyrian solution to the problem of loyalty was both brutal and brilliant. At the height of the Neo-Assyrian Empire, which stretched from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean Sea, the king faced an impossible task. How do you control dozens of conquered provinces, each with its own language, gods, and rebellious nobles, when you sit on a throne hundreds of miles away? Previous empires had relied on local rulers who often betrayed them the moment the army left. The Assyrian answer was a radical overhaul of provincial government, one that permanently changed how an empire could be managed. They created a corps of professional officials who owed everything to the king and nothing to local bloodlines, and many of these officials were eunuchs. The Assyrian court used a specific term for these men. They called them Shah-Rishi, which means he who is of the head, a phrase that referred to their position as personal attendants to the ruler. The practice of employing eunuchs in high office was not new in the ancient world, but the Assyrians turned it into a systematic tool of administration. The logic was cold and practical. A eunuch could not father children, he could not found a dynasty, he could not build a family power base that might one day challenge the throne. Every ounce of his ambition was tied directly to the king who appointed him. His loyalty was enforced by his biology. He had no alternative future. These men were placed in the most sensitive positions across the empire. They served as provincial governors, commanders of fortresses, overseers of royal estates, and even as generals leading armies into battle. The Assyrian king Tiglath-Pileser III, who reigned in the 8th century before the Common Era, is credited with reorganizing the provinces into a standardized system. He divided the conquered territories into roughly 70 provinces, each with a fixed border, a capital city, and a governor appointed from the palace. The governors were responsible for collecting taxes, raising troops, maintaining roads, and enforcing royal decrees. They reported directly to the king, bypassing the old local nobility who had once held hereditary power. To supervise this sprawling network, the Assyrian bureaucracy developed an extraordinary system of communication. Royal messengers traveled along a network of well-maintained roads, changing horses at frequent stations to keep the letters moving at speed. A clay tablet cache discovered at the ancient city of Nimrud contains thousands of letters exchanged between the king and his officials. Some are terse reports. The harvest in province Arpad is poor. We need to reduce the tax quota. Others are frantic warnings. A neighboring kingdom is gathering troops along the border. The governors wrote in Akkadian on clay tablets, using a standardized script that any Assyrian scribe could read. The king did not simply issue orders. He also demanded constant intelligence. One tablet instructs a governor to send a detailed account of every person who enters the province from enemy territory. Another orders an official to investigate a local priest who might be spreading dissent. The eunuch governors were kept on a tight leash. The king conducted regular inspections, sending trusted palace officials to audit accounts and check the condition of fortifications. If a governor fell behind on tax payments or failed to suppress a rebellion quickly, he risked immediate removal and replacement. The archives show that promotions and demotions were common. A successful governor might be recalled to the capital to serve as a high chamberlain. A failing one might be executed or reduced to a minor post. The system was designed to create competition and fear, not comfort and stability. Yet it worked. The Assyrian Empire lasted for nearly 3 centuries at its peak, far longer than most conquerors of the ancient world. Its provinces remained loyal even during the reigns of weak kings, because the bureaucracy itself was stronger than any single ruler. There was a darker side to this efficiency. The eunuch system relied on a practice that stripped individuals of a fundamental part of their identity. Historical sources suggest that many eunuchs were recruited from conquered peoples, taken as tribute or prisoners of war, and then trained from childhood in the palace schools. They were given education in reading, writing, administration, and military tactics. They rose through the ranks based on merit, not birth. In a society where family lineage mattered deeply, these men were outsiders who became insiders by the sheer force of the king's trust. Their dependence on the ruler was absolute, and that made them perfect instruments of control. But the very system that ensured loyalty also created a strange vulnerability. Because eunuchs could not have heirs, they often adopted protégés, gays, or passed their knowledge to junior officials who were also eunuchs. Over generations, a class of administrative dynasties emerged that was not based on blood but on training and patronage. The palace became filled with men who had no other allegiance, but who also had no stake in the long-term health of the empire. They served the king, not the kingdom. When the Assyrian heartland finally fell to a coalition of enemies in the late 7th century before the Common Era, the bureaucratic machinery collapsed overnight. The provincial governors had no reason to fight for a distant capital once the king was dead. The empire vanished in a few decades, its palaces burned and its archives buried. Yet the administrative model did not vanish. It was inherited by the Persians, who adopted the Assyrian system of provinces, governors, and roads, but without the eunuch component. The idea of a professional civil service, appointed by merit and loyalty rather than birth, proved too powerful to forget. The eunuch system was a radical experiment in solving the oldest problem of empire: how to trust the people you send to rule far away. It succeeded for a time, and its echoes can still be seen in later bureaucracies that separated personal ambition from political power. Each province became a miniature kingdom, but its ruler held no crown of his own. The Assyrian solution to the challenge of controlling a vast territory was to divide it into roughly 70 provinces, each with fixed borders and a capital city where the governor kept his court. These governors were not drawn from local noble families who might nurse old loyalties or secret ambitions. They were appointed directly by the king, often from the ranks of palace officials whose entire careers depended on royal favor. Many of them were eunuchs, men who could never father children and therefore could never found a dynasty that might challenge the throne. This was a cold calculation, but it worked. A governor with no family to build, no local roots to deepen, and no alternative future to dream of had only one path to power: serving the king with absolute dedication. The provinces were connected by a network of well-maintained roads that cut through mountains and crossed rivers. At regular intervals, relay stations held fresh horses and messengers ready to ride at a moment's notice. A letter from the palace could reach a distant province in a matter of days, and the governor's reply could travel back just as quickly. This speed of communication was unheard of in the ancient world. An Assyrian king did not have to wait weeks for news from his borders. He could receive a report, make a decision, and send his instructions before the situation changed. The clay tablets that survive in the royal archives show this constant flow of information. One governor writes to inform the king that the harvest in his province has exceeded expectations and that the grain tax is ready for transport. Another reports that a neighboring kingdom has been seen gathering forces near the frontier and requests permission to reinforce the local garrison. A third asks for guidance on a dispute between two villages over irrigation rights. These letters reveal a system that was both rigid and responsive. The governors had clear responsibilities: collect the tribute, maintain the roads, keep the peace, and report any unusual activity. But they also had the authority to act quickly in emergencies as long as they informed the palace afterward. The tribute itself was carefully standardized. Each province owed a fixed amount of grain, livestock, silver, and labor, calculated based on its size and productivity. The governor was personally responsible for delivering these goods to the central treasury on schedule. Failure could mean demotion, exile, or worse. The system created a powerful incentive for efficiency. A governor who managed his province well could rise to the highest ranks of the court and enjoy the king's trust. One who let the roads fall into disrepair or allowed tax collection to lag would soon receive a sharply worded letter from Nineveh. Military logistics also depended on this provincial network. When the Assyrian army marched on a campaign, the governors along the route were required to supply food, water, and fresh horses. The palace sent advance notice of the army's movements, and the governors prepared accordingly. This allowed Assyrian forces to move faster and farther than any previous military in the region. An army that could rely on provincial supply depots did not need to waste time foraging or waiting for wagons to catch up. The bureaucracy of the provinces made the Assyrian war machine nearly unstoppable. The letters also show the human side of this system. One tablet contains a plea from a governor who fell gravely ill and asked the king to send a replacement before the harvest season began. Another thanks a governor for sending a gift of fine horses, a gesture of personal loyalty that went beyond official duty. A third scolds a governor for failing to capture fugitives who had crossed his border, warning him that the king's patience had limits. These are not cold documents. They are the voices of real people trying to do their jobs within a vast administrative machine that demanded constant attention and absolute loyalty. The Assyrian provincial system did not vanish with the empire's collapse. It was studied and adapted by the Persians, who created their own network of satrapies, provinces governed by appointed officials who reported directly to the King of Kings. The Greeks under Alexander the Great inherited this system, and the Romans later refined it into the imperial provinces that held their own vast domain together. The idea that a state could be managed through a hierarchy of appointed officials, rather than through local nobles or family bloodlines, was one of the most enduring innovations of the ancient world. And it all began with those 70 provinces, their governors, and the clay tablets that carried the king's voice across 1,000 miles of road. The Persians did not just copy the Assyrian blueprint. They refined it into an instrument of tolerance and efficiency. When Cyrus the Great conquered the vast territories of the Medes, Lydians, and Babylonians, he faced the same challenge that had plagued every empire before him. How do you rule dozens of diverse peoples, each with their own gods, customs, and languages, without sparking constant rebellion? His answer was the satrapy system, a network of provinces that would become the administrative backbone of the largest empire the world had yet seen. Each satrapy was governed by a satrap, a Persian noble appointed directly by the king. The satrap had immense authority. He collected taxes, dispensed justice, maintained roads, and raised local troops. But he was never given free rein. To keep him honest, the Persians placed two other officials in every province, a military commander who answered to a separate chain of command, and a royal secretary who reported directly to the capital at Persepolis. These three figures, the satrap, the general, and the scribe, balanced each other. If any one of them tried to rebel or skim from the treasury, the other two could send word to the king. This separation of powers was a bureaucratic masterstroke, centuries before Montesquieu ever wrote about it. Yet the most famous tool of Persian control was not a document or a seal. It was a person. The King of Kings employed a corps of inspectors known as the eyes and ears of the king. These officials traveled the empire without warning. They would appear at a satrap's court, demand to see the accounts, and interview local leaders about the governor's conduct. Their reports were delivered directly to the throne, bypassing all local hierarchies. A satrap who had been cruel or corrupt might receive a summons to Persepolis, from which he rarely returned. But the system was not purely punitive. The Persian kings also understood that loyalty was best earned through trust. They allowed each satrapy to keep its own laws, its own religion, and its own local leaders, as long as the tribute arrived on time and the roads remained open. This policy of tolerance, remarkable for its era, kept rebellions rare and made the empire remarkably stable. The satraps themselves became wealthy and powerful. Some, like the satrap of Lydia, built palaces that rivaled the king's own, but the bureaucracy kept them in check. A satrap who dreamed of independence knew that the king's eyes were always watching, and that the royal army could march along the royal road, a 1,500-mile highway that linked Susa to Sardis, in just over a week. Messages traveled even faster. Mounted couriers stationed at regular intervals could carry a royal decree from one end of the empire to the other in 7 to 9 days. The Greek historian Herodotus marveled at this system, writing that neither snow nor rain nor heat nor darkness prevented the couriers from completing their appointed rounds. The efficiency of Persian communications allowed the king to govern a territory that stretched from India to Greece, a feat of administration that would not be matched until the Roman Empire at its height. The satrapy system did more than collect taxes. It wove a diverse empire into a single economic unit. Each province specialized in what it produced best. Egypt sent grain, Anatolia sent silver and timber, India sent gold and spices. The royal treasury at Persepolis became a giant clearinghouse where goods and coins flowed in and out. This network of tribute and trade made the Achaemenid Empire not just a political power, but an engine of prosperity that connected distant cultures. The satraps were the cogs in that engine, and the king's eyes were the lubricant that kept everything running smoothly. When Alexander the Great finally conquered the empire, he did not dismantle the satrapy system. He kept it intact, simply replacing the Persian satraps with his own Greek generals. The bureaucratic structure was too effective to abandon. It outlived the dynasty that created it, a testament to the quiet genius of the men who designed it. And somewhere in the ruins of Persepolis, among the carved reliefs showing tribute bearers from every corner of the realm, there is no statue of a satrap or an inspector. Their faces are lost, but their system of divided power and constant oversight remains one of the most influential administrative ideas in history. the Persians did not just conquer the largest empire the world had ever seen. They built a system to hold it together. At its heart was the satrapy, a province governed by a satrap who answered directly to the king of kings, but the satrap was never given total control. A military commander in the same province reported to a different authority, and a royal secretary kept separate records for the palace. This division of power prevented any single official from gathering too much influence. To watch over them all, the king sent out inspectors known as the eyes and ears of the king. These officials traveled the empire without warning, checking accounts, hearing complaints, and sending reports straight back to the capital. A corrupt satrap could be removed before his greed sparked a rebellion. And if a message needed to travel from one end of the empire to the other, the royal road provided a network of relay stations where fresh horses and riders stood ready. A decree from Persepolis could reach the coast of Anatolia in little more than a week. This speed of communication was unheard of in the ancient world. It allowed the Persians to govern distant provinces with a level of control that earlier empires could only dream of, but the system also respected local traditions. Each satrapy kept its own laws, its own gods, and its own local leaders, as long as the tribute arrived on time. This blend of firm oversight and cultural tolerance kept the peace across dozens of different peoples. The bureaucracy did not just collect taxes, it wove a vast economic network with grain from Egypt, silver from Anatolia, and spices from India flowing through the imperial treasury. The Persian system proved so effective that when Alexander the Great conquered the empire, he kept it largely intact. The next empire to rise would need its own solution for managing a vast territory. 1,000 miles to the east, another empire was writing its own rulebook of power. The Mauryan Empire, which rose in India around 320 years before the Common Era, faced the same fundamental problem as the Persians and Assyrians. How do you govern a vast territory filled with diverse peoples, dense forests, and rival kingdoms? But the Mauryans had an advantage that no previous empire possessed. They had a manual, a single comprehensive text that laid out in astonishing detail exactly how a state should be run. That text is called the Arthashastra, and it is one of the most remarkable bureaucratic documents ever written. The Arthashastra is traditionally attributed to a man named Chanakya, a scholar and advisor to the first Mauryan emperor, Chandragupta. Its title translates roughly to the science of wealth or the science of political economy, but it is far more than a book about money. It is a complete guide to statecraft, covering everything from tax collection and espionage to city planning and foreign policy. The text is divided into 15 books with hundreds of sections that read like a bureaucratic handbook. It tells a ruler exactly how to organize his administration, how to choose his ministers, how to supervise provincial governors, and even how to inspect the kitchens to prevent poisoning. What makes the Arthashastra so extraordinary is its cold, practical tone. It does not moralize, it does not appeal to divine will, it simply describes what works. For example, the text instructs the king to appoint a network of spies who pose as merchants, ascetics, and householders. These spies are to report on the conduct of officials, the mood of the people, and the strength of neighboring kingdoms. The manual even advises on how to test the loyalty of ministers by planting false rumors and watching their reactions. This is not a work of philosophy. It is a bureaucratic instruction manual written by someone who understood that an empire depends on information and control. The manual also provides a detailed description of the treasury. It specifies that the treasury should be built with strong walls, a single entrance, and a secret escape tunnel. The chief treasurer must keep records of every coin, every ingot, and every gem. He must also maintain a reserve fund for emergencies. The text goes on to describe the duties of the chief collector of taxes, who must survey the land, assess the crop yields, and calculate what each village owes. The tax rates are not arbitrary. They are based on soil quality, irrigation access, and even the type of crop grown. A field of rice is taxed differently than a field of barley. This level of bureaucratic precision was almost unheard of in the ancient world. The Arthashastra also outlines the structure of the Mauryan civil service. The empire was divided into provinces, each ruled by a prince or a governor appointed by the emperor. Below them were district officers, village accountants, and a host of inspectors who checked weights and measures, monitored market prices, and ensured that roads and wells were maintained. The manual even contains instructions for building a new city, specifying the width of streets, the location of temples and markets, and the placement of sewage drains. It reads like a cross between a legal code and an urban planning guide. One of the most fascinating sections deals with the Department of Commerce. The state was supposed to set fair prices for goods, regulate trade, and inspect commodities for quality. The manual warns against adulteration and fraud, prescribing fines for merchants who cheat. It even discusses how to manage state-owned enterprises, such as mines, forests, and textile workshops. The Mauryan state was not a passive collector of taxes. It was an active participant in the economy, owning resources and managing production. This required a bureaucracy of accountants, supervisors, and inspectors who could track inventories and prevent theft. The Arthashastra also emphasizes the importance of record-keeping. Every transaction, every payment, every official decision was to be written down. The manual describes a system of double-entry bookkeeping, with one set of records kept by the local official and another by a central auditor. Discrepancies were investigated immediately. This created a culture of accountability that would have impressed even the most rigorous modern accountant. The text even notes that the king himself should review the accounts regularly, a practice that kept even the highest officials honest. The manual did not just exist on paper. It was put into practice during the reign of Chandragupta and his successors. Greek ambassadors who visited the Mauryan court left accounts of a highly organized state with a sophisticated bureaucracy. One Greek writer, Megasthenes, described a city administration that included officials in charge of markets, harbors, public works, and even the registration of births and deaths. He noted that the Mauryans kept detailed records of every citizen, their occupation, and their wealth. This allowed the state to tax fairly and to call upon skilled workers for public projects. The Arthashastra was not a secret document. It was copied and studied for centuries, influencing later Indian kingdoms and even reaching Southeast Asia. But after the decline of the Mauryan Empire, it was lost for nearly 2,000 years. A copy was rediscovered in the early 20th century by a scholar who found a palm leaf manuscript in a library in Mysore. When it was published, it revolutionized the understanding of ancient Indian statecraft. It revealed that the Mauryans had created one of the most advanced administrative systems of the ancient world, a system based not on the whim of a ruler but on a written code of bureaucratic practice. The Arthashastra remains a testament to the power of a manual. It is a reminder that the most enduring empires are not built by armies alone. They are built by systems, by rules, and by the quiet army of clerks and inspectors who enforce them. The Arthashastra described how to spy on your own ministers. Kautilya, the author and chief advisor to the first Mauryan emperor, wrote that a ruler should never fully trust even his closest advisors. The manual instructed the king to plant secret agents in every government office, posing as clerks, servants, or even beggars. These agents would listen to conversations, observe behavior, and report any sign of disloyalty or corruption. The information flowed upward through a carefully structured hierarchy, from village-level informants to district supervisors to the king's own intelligence bureau. Kautilya did not stop at internal surveillance. He also detailed how to infiltrate enemy courts, spread rumors to destabilize rival kingdoms, and recruit double agents. The entire network was designed to give the ruler a complete picture of his realm, from the mood of the people to the plans of foreign adversaries. But the Arthashastra was far more than a spy manual. It laid out a comprehensive system of public administration that touched every aspect of daily life. The empire was divided into provinces, districts, and villages, each with its own set of officials. At the top, the king ruled with the help of a council of ministers. Below them, provincial governors managed large regions, while district officers oversaw groups of villages. At the very bottom, village heads handled local disputes, collected taxes, and maintained public order. Every official had written duties. The books specified exactly how much grain each village owed based on soil quality and rainfall. Tax collectors were required to keep detailed records and submit regular reports to the central treasury. Auditors checked those records for errors or fraud. If a tax collector fell short, he had to make up the difference from his own pocket. This accountability was built into the system. The state also managed public works on a massive scale. The Arthashastra included instructions for building roads, digging wells, and constructing irrigation canals. Officials were assigned to maintain these projects and to ensure that they benefited the largest number of people. During times of drought or famine, the king was expected to open state granaries and distribute food to the hungry. The manual even recommended that the government start public works projects, such as building forts or temples, to provide employment for those who had lost their crops. This was not charity. It was a strategy to prevent unrest and keep the population loyal. Kautilya understood that a hungry people were a dangerous people. The sophistication of the Mauryan bureaucracy extended to economic regulation. The state set prices for essential goods, monitored markets for cheating, and inspected weights and measures. Merchants who sold adulterated goods faced heavy fines. Officials collected tolls at road crossings and harbor docks. The treasury kept reserves of gold, silver, and grain to stabilize the economy during crises. Every coin minted by the state carried a mark that showed its purity. Counterfeiters were punished severely. This level of control required an army of clerks, accountants, and supervisors. The Arthashastra estimated that a well-run government needed thousands of trained officials, each knowing his specific role and reporting through a clear chain of command. What makes this system so remarkable is that it was written down centuries before any similar administrative manual appeared in Europe or the Middle East. The text shows that the Mauryan rulers thought about governance in a systematic, almost scientific way. They saw the state as a machine that could be designed and improved. And they entrusted the operation of that machine not to nobles or priests, but to a professional civil service. The spies, the accountants, the village heads, and the district officers were the forgotten cogs that kept the empire running. Their names are lost, but their methods are preserved in the pages of Kautilya's masterpiece, a document that still feels modern, even after more than 2,000 years. A different kind of bureaucracy was taking shape on the other side of Asia. While the Mauryans wrote manuals on espionage and accounting, the Han dynasty of China turned civil service into a pathway to power that did not depend on noble birth. For centuries before the Han, Chinese rulers had relied on aristocratic families to fill official posts. A man became a minister because his father had been one. But this system bred corruption and incompetence. The Emperor Wu, who reigned from 141 to 87 before the Common Era, decided to change it. He needed loyal and capable administrators to manage his expanding empire, not nobles who might put their family interests first. His solution was to create a system of recommendations. Local officials were required to nominate talented young men from their districts, regardless of their social standing. These candidates were then brought to the capital, where they were examined on their knowledge of Confucian texts, history, and law. The best among them were appointed to government positions. This was not a full-scale written exam system yet. That would come later under the Tang and Song dynasties. But it was the seed of an idea that would transform governance. The Han dynasty created a class of scholar officials who owed their careers to their own learning, not to their bloodline. These men staffed the imperial bureaucracy at every level, from county magistrates to court advisors. They managed tax collection, oversaw public works, judged legal disputes, and advised the emperor on policy. Their training in Confucian philosophy emphasized moral conduct, loyalty, and the importance of ritual. The state even established an imperial university where hundreds of students studied the classics in preparation for official life. By the end of the Han dynasty, that university had grown to over 30,000 students. The system was far from perfect. Wealthy families could still buy influence. Recommendations were sometimes given to friends or relatives, but the principle had been established. A man could rise through merit rather than birth. This idea was revolutionary. It meant that the most talented individuals from across the empire could find a place in government, bringing diverse perspectives and local knowledge to the capital. The Han bureaucracy was vast and layered. At the top stood the three excellencies, the highest officials who oversaw the civil service, the military, and the censors. Below them were 9 ministers responsible for specific functions like justice, revenue, and ceremonies. Each province was governed by a grand administrator appointed by the court. Below them, county magistrates managed local affairs, and at the very bottom, village heads kept the peace and collected taxes. Every official was subject to inspection by traveling censors who reported misconduct directly to the emperor. This system of checks and balances was designed to prevent corruption and ensure that orders from the capital reached the furthest corners of the realm. The Han bureaucracy did not just collect taxes, it also managed massive state projects such as the construction of roads, canals, and granaries. It regulated trade, set standards for weights and measures, and even distributed grain during famines. The entire apparatus depended on written records, which were kept on bamboo strips tied together with silk thread. Scribes in every county office documented land ownership, population numbers, and court cases. These records were sent to the capital, where they were compiled into reports for the emperor. The sheer volume of paperwork was immense. One surviving inventory from a Han county lists over 20,000 bamboo documents in a single archive. The scholar officials who ran this system were trained to think in terms of order and efficiency. They saw the empire as a harmonious whole that needed careful management, much like a household. Their philosophy of governance emphasized balance, moderation, and the responsibility of the ruler to care for the people. This worldview shaped every decision they made, from adjusting tax rates to planning irrigation systems. The Han dynasty lasted for over 4 centuries, and its bureaucratic innovations outlived the dynasty itself. When the empire fell, the ideal of a merit-based civil service remained embedded in Chinese culture. It would be revived and refined by later dynasties, eventually becoming the famous Imperial Examination system that lasted into the 20th century. The seeds planted by Emperor Wu and his scholar officials grew into one of the most enduring administrative traditions in human history. And today, the idea that a person should be hired based on ability rather than birth is so common that we rarely stop to think about where it came from. It came from a Chinese emperor who wanted better governors, and from the thousands of unnamed officials who proved that a farmer's son could run a province just as well as a nobleman's. The Han examination halls were quiet, but the competition was fierce. In those wooden chambers, rows of candidates sat on simple mats, each one facing a roll of bamboo strips and a brush. They had traveled from distant villages and provincial towns, many spending years memorizing the ancient texts that would decide their future. The examination tested knowledge of the Confucian classics, which taught moral philosophy, proper conduct, and the art of governance. It also covered law, history, and administrative procedure. A candidate who passed could expect a position in the imperial bureaucracy, a post that brought respect, a steady income, and the chance to rise through the ranks. For a farmer's son, this was the only path to power that did not depend on noble birth or military strength. The system was not a sudden invention. It grew out of earlier hand practices of recommendation and informal testing. But by the reign of Emperor Wu, it had become a formal process. Local officials were required to identify talented young men in their districts and send them to the capital. There, the emperor himself sometimes presided over the final review. The examinations were not open to everyone. Women were excluded, and the poor could rarely afford the years of study required. But for the first time in Chinese history, a man's family name no longer guaranteed his place in government. A brilliant scholar from a humble village could rise to become a minister, while the son of a nobleman who neglected his studies could be passed over. This merit-based system created a new class of officials known as the scholar gentry. These men were not warriors, they were not priests, they were professional administrators who had earned their positions through learning. They staffed the vast imperial bureaucracy at every level. County magistrates managed local taxes, settled disputes, and maintained public order. Provincial governors oversaw irrigation projects, granaries, and road networks. At the highest level, the Grand Counselor advised the emperor on policy and foreign affairs. Every one of these officials had passed through the same gate of examination, memorizing the same texts and absorbing the same Confucian values. Those values emphasized loyalty to the ruler, filial piety, and the importance of moral example. The examinations did not just test knowledge, they shaped character. A candidate who had spent years studying the Analects of Confucius came to believe that a good ruler governed by virtue, not by force. The bureaucracy that emerged from this system was remarkably stable and competent. It outlasted the Han dynasty itself. When the empire fragmented in the centuries after the Han, the ideal of the scholar official remained. Later dynasties, especially the Tang and Song, revived and expanded the examination system. It became the backbone of Chinese governance for nearly 2,000 years. The exams were a tool of control as much as a source of talent. By requiring all officials to share a common education in the Confucian classics, the state ensured that its administrators thought alike. They spoke the same language of ethics and order. They understood the same precedents and principles. This unity of mind made the empire easier to govern. A magistrate in a distant province would make decisions that aligned with the expectations of the court, because his training had taught him to see the world through the same lens. Yet the system also opened doors. For centuries, it allowed talented individuals from across the social spectrum to contribute to the running of the state. The farmer's son who passed the exam brought local knowledge and fresh perspective to the capital. The scholar gentry were not a closed aristocracy. They were a rotating class of educated men, constantly refreshed by new blood from the provinces. The examination halls became symbols of hope and fairness. They stood for the idea that a person's worth was not determined by birth, but by effort and ability. In a world where most societies clung to hereditary power, this was a radical departure, and it proved so effective that it shaped not only China but also its neighbors, including Korea and Vietnam. The quiet rows of candidates brushing characters onto bamboo strips were the seeds of a bureaucratic tradition that would last longer than any dynasty. Their work and the system that selected them remains one of the most influential innovations in the history of government. The Roman census was not a simple count of people. It was the spine of the empire, a vast administrative spine that held together a territory stretching from Britain to Egypt. Every 5 years, 2 high officials called censors were elected to conduct a thorough registration of every Roman citizen. They recorded names, ages, families, and most importantly, property. How much land did you own? How many slaves? How many cattle? What was your workshop worth? The answers determined your place in the social order and the taxes you owed, but the census did not stop in the city of Rome. Provincial governors carried out similar counts across the conquered lands. Each province was divided into communities, each community into villages, and each village into households. Local scribes filled out papyrus rolls with names and numbers. Those rolls were sent to the provincial capital, where clerks compiled them into summaries. The summaries then traveled to Rome by ship or along the paved roads to be stored in the state archives on the Capitoline Hill. The sheer volume of paperwork was staggering. One surviving document from Roman Egypt lists over 500 taxpayers in a single village, each with their assessed property and the amount they owed. The tax system itself was a delicate machine. The empire operated on a mix of direct and indirect taxes. Land tax, the most important, was calculated based on the size and quality of fields. A farmer growing wheat in a fertile valley paid more than one scratching barley from rocky hills. The census provided the baseline data. Once every 15 years, a new assessment was made, adjusting rates to reflect changes in harvests or population shifts. The system required an army of accountants, inspectors, and collectors. Many of these officials were not Romans at all. They were local elites who saw a chance to gain status and profit by serving the empire. They hired scribes to keep ledgers, sent agents to collect grain, and forwarded the proceeds to the provincial treasury. The Roman state also employed professional tax farmers, known as publicani, who bid for the right to collect taxes in a region. They paid the expected amount upfront and then collected what they could from the locals, keeping any surplus as profit. This system was efficient but often brutal, and it bred resentment. In response, later emperors replaced the tax farmers with salaried officials who had no incentive to squeeze the population. The bureaucracy learned from its own mistakes. This whole edifice rested on the census. Without it, the state would be blind. It would not know how many soldiers it could draft, how much grain it could expect, or which provinces were growing rich and which were falling into poverty. The censors were among the most respected figures in Roman public life. To be chosen as censor was a mark of supreme trust. The historian Livy described how a censor's judgment could elevate a man's reputation or tarnish it beyond repair. They had the power to remove a senator from the Senate for misconduct. They could move a citizen from a wealthy tribe to a poorer one. Their decisions shaped the social hierarchy. And when the census was complete, they performed a solemn purification ceremony called the lustrum, a ritual that cleansed the entire Roman people and marked the start of a new 5-year cycle. The census rolls were updated, filed, and stored in the tabularium, the state record office that still stands at the edge of the Roman Forum. Those rolls were not just numbers. They were the bones of the empire, the systematic knowledge that allowed Rome to rule the known world without a modern communications network. When the empire finally crumbled centuries later, the bureaucracy did not vanish entirely. Its methods were absorbed by the Byzantine state and later by the kingdoms of medieval Europe. The Roman census, with its meticulous lists and its faith in the power of written records, became a ghost that haunted the governments of 1,000 years. And somewhere in the ruins of a provincial archive, a handful of faded papyri still whisper the names of forgotten taxpayers, the quiet pillars of an empire that rose on paper as much as on stone. The Roman census was not about selecting officials. It was about counting everything. Every 5 years, 2 specially elected censors took on the monumental task of recording every Roman citizen and all their belongings. They wanted to know how much land a man owned, how many slaves he commanded, how many cattle grazed in his fields, and what his workshop produced. These details determined not only his taxes but also his social rank. The richer a citizen was, the more he paid, but also the more influence he held in public life. The census rolls became the master record of the entire Roman population. a living document that the state used to decide who could vote, who could serve in the army, and who owed what to the treasury. But the census was only the beginning. Once the numbers were collected, the machinery of tax collection had to turn those figures into silver and grain. The Roman system relied on a mix of direct state officials and private contractors known as publicani. These contractors bid for the right to collect taxes in a specific region. They paid the expected amount to the treasury upfront, then traveled through their assigned province gathering what was owed from the local population. Any surplus they collected beyond their bid became their profit. This system was efficient for the state, which received its money immediately without having to manage a large collection staff. But it also created enormous pressure on ordinary people, because the publicani had every incentive to extract as much as possible. The Roman government eventually realized the dangers of this approach and began shifting towards salaried officials who reported to the provincial governor. The treasury itself was split into two main funds. The aerarium sat in the temple of Saturn in the Roman Forum and held the state's traditional revenues. The fiscus was the emperor's personal treasury, which grew to control most of the empire's wealth as the imperial system matured. Together, they formed a complex financial network that required thousands of clerks, accountants, and inspectors to keep balanced. The most urgent task for this bureaucracy was feeding the city of Rome. By the 1st century of the Common Era, the capital held over 1 million residents, far more than the surrounding countryside could support. The solution was the annona, the state-managed grain supply. Every year, massive shipments of wheat arrived from Egypt, North Africa, and Sicily. These were not private cargoes. They were state requisitions collected as taxes in kind from the provinces and shipped to Rome in government-controlled vessels. The bureaucracy behind the annona was staggering. Provincial officials assessed how much grain each farming region could provide. They arranged for transport down rivers and across the sea. At the port of Ostia, a dedicated team of inspectors, warehouse keepers, and accountants received the shipments. They checked the quality of the grain, recorded the quantities, and stored it in vast horia, the stone warehouses that lined the Tiber River. From there, the grain was distributed to registered citizens who held the right to a monthly ration. The legions operated on a similar system. Each military unit had its own supply officers who tracked rations, fodder for horses, and equipment. The entire imperial army, spread across thousands of miles, depended on the same bureaucratic principles of counting, recording, and transporting resources. All of this record-keeping required a specialized class of officials known as tabularii. These were the archivists and accountants of the Roman state. They worked in provincial headquarters, in the great warehouses of Ostia, and in the central record offices on the Capitoline Hill. They maintained ledgers on wax tablets and papyrus scrolls, tracking every grain of wheat, every coin of tax revenue, and every soldier's pay. When a governor died in office, the tabularii sealed his accounts and sent them to Rome for audit. When a tax collector fell short of his quota, the tabularii noted the shortfall and initiated collection proceedings. Their work was invisible to the public, but without it, the empire would have ground to a halt. The tabularii were often imperial freedmen, former slaves who had been educated in accounting and given positions of trust. They owed their careers entirely to the emperor and had no local loyalties to compromise their work. This made them reliable cogs in the administrative machine. The records they kept allowed the Roman state to project power across 3 continents, to move armies, to feed cities, and to collect the wealth that sustained the entire structure. And when the empire finally fell, many of those records simply rotted away, leaving only scattered fragments that hint at the immense bureaucratic effort that once held the Mediterranean world together. The men who managed those records followed a carefully designed career ladder. The Romans called it the cursus honorum, which means the course of honors. It was a structured sequence of public offices that a Roman politician had to climb step by step before reaching the highest positions in the state. This system did more than just organize ambition. It created a pipeline of experienced administrators who understood the empire from the ground up. A young man from a noble family typically began his career as a military tribune, serving for a few years with the legions to learn discipline and command. From there, he could stand for election as a quaestor, the first formal magistracy. Quaestors managed public finances. They oversaw the treasury in Rome or served as financial officers in the provinces. This role taught them the art of counting coins, auditing accounts, and tracking expenditures. Without this training, a future governor would not know how to manage a province without bankrupting it. The next step was the aedileship, a position responsible for the city of Rome itself. Aediles maintained public buildings, organized festivals, and supervised the grain supply. They learned how to coordinate large workforces, handle contracts with suppliers, and keep the restless population of the capital fed and entertained. It was a hands-on education in urban administration. Then came the praetorship, a crucial office that combined legal authority with military command. Praetors presided over courts in Rome, settling disputes and interpreting the law. After their year in office, they often became provincial governors, ruling a territory with near absolute power. This was where the cursus honorum truly paid off. A man who had served as quaestor, aedile, and praetor had already spent a decade learning how to manage money, people, and justice. By the time he reached the consulship, the highest elected office, he possessed a practical knowledge of governance that no textbook could provide. The two consuls who held office each year were the heads of state and the commanders-in-chief of the armies. But their term lasted only 12 months. After serving as consul, a man typically became a proconsul, governing a major province for 1 or more years. This rotation of leadership prevented any single individual from accumulating too much power, while ensuring that the empire always had a pool of seasoned administrators ready to step in. The cursus honorum was not open to everyone. Only senators and their sons could run for these offices, and the cost of campaigning and holding public positions was enormous. Many politicians went deep into debt financing games and buildings to win votes, but the system also created a culture of public service. A Roman aristocrat measured his worth not by how much money he made, but by the offices he held and the monuments he built for the city. The entire machinery of empire relied on these men, who moved through a revolving door of posts, bringing their experience from the treasury to the battlefield to the courtroom. Below the senatorial class, the equestrian order provided another layer of administrators. Equestrians were wealthy citizens who did not hold elected office but served as procurators, financial agents, and provincial governors in smaller imperial provinces. They managed state monopolies, collected customs duties, and oversaw the imperial postal service. Together, the senators and equestrians formed a professional ruling class that was deeply invested in the stability of the empire. Their careers depended on the empire functioning smoothly. A corrupt governor could be prosecuted after his term ended. An incompetent administrator could ruin his reputation forever. The cursus honorum ensured that the men who ran the empire had spent a lifetime learning how to do it. When a crisis erupted, there was always someone in Rome who had governed a similar province, commanded a similar army, or managed a similar budget. This institutional memory was the empire's greatest asset. It allowed Rome to absorb defeats, survive civil wars, and adapt to changing circumstances for over 5 centuries. The ladder of offices was not just a political game. It was the training ground for the forgotten bureaucrats who kept the Roman world spinning, one term at a time. A young Roman aristocrat spent his entire life climbing a ladder of power. That ladder was the cursus honorum, a carefully ordered sequence of public offices that every ambitious politician had to ascend step by step. The system demanded patience. A man could not jump straight to the top. He had to prove himself at each rung, learning the practical skills of governance before he could command a province or lead an army. The first step was the quaestorship. Quaestors were the empire's financial officers. They managed the state treasury in Rome or served as financial assistants to provincial governors. Their job was to track every coin that came in and went out, to audit accounts, and to ensure that taxes reached the correct destination. A quaestor learned how to spot a missing shipment of grain and how to balance a ledger that stretched across hundreds of miles. Without this training, a future governor would not know whether his province was running a surplus or heading toward bankruptcy. The next rung was the aedileship. Aediles took charge of the city of Rome itself. They maintained the temples, the markets, the streets, and the sewers. They organized the public games that kept the population entertained and the grain distributions that kept them fed. An aedile had to negotiate with contractors, inspect public buildings for safety, and manage the vast warehouses along the Tiber. It was a hands-on education in urban logistics, a crash course in how to keep 1 million people calm and supplied. After the aedileship came the praetorship. Praetors presided over the law courts in Rome, hearing civil cases and interpreting legal disputes, but the praetorship also carried military authority. After their year in the courts, many praetors went on to govern provinces or command legions. This office taught a man how to balance justice with power, how to issue rulings that would be accepted as fair, and how to manage the complex legal claims that arose between Roman citizens and provincials. The highest elected office was the consulship. 2 consuls were chosen each year to serve as the heads of state. They commanded the armies, presided over the Senate, and represented the authority of the Roman people. But their term lasted only 12 months. After stepping down, a former consul typically became a proconsul, governing a major province for 1 or more years. This rotation kept power from settling in any single pair of hands and ensured that the empire always had a pool of men who had already governed at the highest level. Below the senatorial class, the equestrian order provided another reservoir of administrators. Equestrians were wealthy citizens who did not hold elected office but served as procurators managing imperial estates, as financial agents collecting customs duties, and as governors of smaller imperial provinces that did not require a senatorial commander. They ran the state postal service, supervised mining operations, and oversaw the collection of port taxes. Together, senators and equestrians formed a professional ruling class whose entire careers depended on the empire functioning smoothly. A successful governor brought his province more revenue. A failed one faced prosecution and disgrace. The system created a powerful incentive to learn the craft of administration. Every quaestor, aedile, and praetor had spent years studying the practical details of finance, law, and public works before they ever sat in a governor's palace. They were forgotten cogs, but they made the machine move. Yet this same ladder of honor had a hidden flaw. The path to office required enormous personal wealth. A candidate for the aedileship often spent a fortune on public games to win votes. Many politicians borrowed heavily from wealthy patrons, and those debts created obligations that could corrupt their later decisions. A governor who owed his career to a moneylender might look the other way when that moneylender's agents exploited the province. The Senate itself was a club of the rich, and its members often protected their own. The cursus honorum produced skilled administrators, but it also produced men who saw provincial rule as a chance to recoup their expenses. The same bureaucracy that held the empire together also created opportunities for hidden exploitation. And as the centuries passed, that tension between competence and corruption would shape the fate of Rome. The Byzantine Empire faced a crisis that demanded a radical rethinking of how power was divided. For centuries, the Roman system had carefully separated civil and military authority. A governor handled taxes and justice, while a general commanded the troops. This separation was meant to prevent any single official from becoming too powerful, but by the 7th century the empire was fighting for its life. Persian armies had swept through the eastern provinces, Slavic tribes poured into the Balkans, and then came the Arab conquests, which stripped away Egypt, Syria, and North Africa almost overnight. The old system of divided command was too slow. A governor could not raise troops fast enough, and a general could not collect taxes to supply his army. The empire needed a new structure, one that fused civil and military power into a single office. The solution was the theme system. The word theme comes from the Greek thema, meaning a placed or stationed body of troops. At first, a theme was simply a military division, a corps of soldiers stationed in a specific region. But over time, the term came to describe the entire province in which those soldiers were based. And the man who commanded both the army and the province was called the strategos, a general with full authority over military defense, tax collection, justice, and administration. This fusion of roles was a direct response to the empire's shrinking borders. With fewer resources and constant threats, the Byzantines could no longer afford the luxury of separation. The strategos reported directly to the emperor in Constantinople. He had no rival governor to slow him down. When a raid came across the border, he could mobilize the local troops immediately without waiting for permission from a distant civil servant. When taxes needed to be collected, he used the same soldiers who defended the province to enforce payment. This efficiency saved the empire, but it also created a new kind of official, a military bureaucrat who combined the sword and the ledger in one hand. The theme system was not invented all at once. It evolved over decades, beginning under the Emperor Heraclius in the early 7th century and reaching its mature form under the Isaurian dynasty in the 8th century. The empire was divided into a series of themes, each with its own strategos. The closest themes to Constantinople were the richest and most heavily guarded. The frontier themes were poorer and more exposed, but their soldiers were battle-hardened. Each theme was further divided into smaller districts called tormai, commanded by tormashes, and below them were banda, commanded by comes. This hierarchy mirrored the old Roman military chain of command, but now it governed civil life as well. The soldiers in the themes were not mercenaries or conscripts. They were soldier farmers, men who received land grants in exchange for hereditary military service. This system created a class of freeholding soldiers who had a direct stake in defending their own farms. They paid no land tax, but they had to provide their own equipment and report for duty when called. The strategos kept a register of these soldiers, noting their names, their landholdings, and the condition of their weapons. When a campaign was announced, the strategos would assemble his forces from these registers, ensuring that every farmer soldier knew his place in the battle line. This fusion of civil and military authority made the strategos one of the most powerful officials in the Byzantine world. Some strategoi became so influential that they challenged the emperor himself. To keep them in check, the court in Constantinople employed a series of countermeasures. The strategos was appointed by the emperor and could be removed at any time. His term was often limited to a few years, preventing him from building a local power base. The central government also sent out inspectors, called the imperial notaries, who reviewed the strategos' accounts and reported any irregularities. The theme system was not a license for rebellion. It was a carefully balanced tool of survival, one that allowed the Byzantine state to punch above its weight for centuries. By the 10th century, the themes had stabilized the frontier and allowed the empire to go on the offensive. But the system also had limits. As the empire grew richer and more powerful, the soldier farmers were gradually replaced by professional mercenaries, and the strategoi became more like courtiers than fighting generals. The themes themselves were merged and reorganized, losing their original character. Yet the core idea that civil and military power could be fused in times of crisis remained a lesson that later empires would study. The Byzantine theme system was a bureaucratic response to a world falling apart, and it worked long enough to turn a dying empire into a medieval superpower. The strategos commanded both the army and the tax collectors, a fusion of power that earlier Roman governors would have found shocking. In the old system, a civil official and a military general reported separately to the emperor, each checking the other. But the Byzantine theme system erased that boundary. The strategos was the single authority in his province, responsible for defense, justice, and revenue. He decided when to call up the soldier farmers from their fields, where to station border watchtowers, and how much grain to send to Constantinople. This concentration of authority allowed the empire to react quickly to raids and revolts, but it also required careful oversight. The emperor appointed the strategos, limited his term to a few years, and sent imperial inspectors to audit his accounts. A strategos who hoarded supplies or neglected his fortifications could be removed before his ambition grew dangerous. The theme system was not a simple grant of power. It was a delicate balance between local flexibility and central control. Administratively, each theme was subdivided into smaller districts called tormai, each led by a tormashes, and below them were banda led by a comes. These officers reported up the chain, ensuring that orders from the strategos reached every village and that information about harvests, troop readiness, and local disputes flowed back to the capital. The soldier farmers themselves formed the backbone of this structure. They were registered in detailed rolls that recorded their land parcels, equipment, and family members. When a campaign was announced, the strategos consulted these rolls to assemble his forces, knowing exactly how many men each district could provide. This system of hereditary military service ensured that the army was always available without draining the treasury, because the soldiers fed themselves from their own fields. Yet the strategos was not the only powerful bureaucrat in the Byzantine world. While he managed the provinces, the imperial court in Constantinople relied on a class of officials known as logothetes. The word logothetes means one who accounts or computes, and that is precisely what they did. They oversaw the empire's finances, its diplomatic correspondence, and its internal communications. The logothete of the treasury tracked every gold coin that entered the imperial coffers, from land taxes and customs duties to fines and tribute payments. The logothete of the post managed the imperial messenger service, maintaining relay stations along the great roads and ensuring that news from the frontiers reached the capital within days. And the logothete of the foreign office handled relations with neighboring kingdoms, composing letters in elegant Greek, receiving ambassadors, and negotiating treaties. These men were the invisible hands that kept the empire running between crises. They did not lead armies or govern provinces, but they controlled the information and money that made military and provincial rule possible. A good logothete could spot a shortfall in tax revenue months before it became a crisis. He could recommend adjustments to the budget, shift funds from a peaceful theme to a threatened one, and ensure that the emperor always had enough gold to pay the mercenaries or bribe a barbarian chieftain. The logothetes were often drawn from the educated elites of Constantinople, men who had studied rhetoric, law, and mathematics. They served for long periods, accumulating deep knowledge of the state's finances and foreign affairs. This continuity gave the Byzantine bureaucracy a remarkable memory. While emperors came and went, the logothetes remained, providing stability through periods of chaos. The theme system and the logothetes together formed a flexible framework that allowed the Byzantine Empire to survive for over 1,000 years. When one frontier faced attack, the strategos could shift troops from another theme, and the logothetes would adjust the budget to cover the cost. When the treasury ran low, the logothetes could raise taxes in a theme that had enjoyed a good harvest, or they could negotiate a loan from a wealthy monastery. This adaptability was the empire's greatest strength. It did not rely on a rigid hierarchy or a single charismatic leader. Instead, It depended on a network of trained officials who understood how to balance resources against threats. The Byzantine bureaucracy was not perfect. It was prone to corruption and infighting, especially in later centuries, but it was resilient, bending under pressure without breaking. And that resilience was what allowed a remnant of the Roman Empire to outlast every other ancient state in Europe and the Middle East, holding on until the cannons of the Ottoman Turks finally breached its walls in the 15th century. High in the Andes, an empire stretched for over 2,000 miles without a single written word. The Inca ruled a territory larger than the Roman Empire at its height, yet they had no alphabet, no hieroglyphs, and no clay tablets. Their solution was both simple and astonishingly complex, a system of knotted cords called the Quipu. Imagine a main rope thick as a finger, from which dozens or even hundreds of colored strings hung like a fringe. Each string held a series of knots tied at precise intervals. The color of the string, its position, the type of knot, and the number of knots all carried meaning. A yellow string might represent gold, while a red one stood for soldiers. A simple overhand knot could mean 1, a figure 8 knot meant 10, and a complex series of knots could represent hundreds or thousands. The Quipu was a three-dimensional spreadsheet, a database woven from cotton or wool. The Inca state depended entirely on these cords. Every village, every province, every storehouse had its records kept in quipus. When a census was needed, officials called quipucamayos, the knot keepers, traveled from village to village. They asked the local headman how many people lived there, how many llamas grazed, how much maize had been harvested. Then they tied the answers into a quipu. The completed cords were sent to the capital at Cusco, where Master Quipucamayos read the knots and compiled a summary for the emperor. No written letters, no clay tablets, just the language of twisted fibers. The system was so efficient that the Inca could manage the logistics of a massive army without a single scribe. When a campaign was planned, the Quipucamayos calculated how many soldiers were needed, how much food they would consume, and how many llamas would carry the supplies. They recorded everything on cords, and messengers carried those cords across the empire along the vast road network. At each way station, a new runner took the quipu and sprinted to the next post. The emperor in Cusco could receive a report from a province 400 miles away in a matter of days. He could order a shipment of grain from one valley to another, and the quipucamayos would tie the instructions into a new cord, sending it back with the same relay of runners. The quipu was not just for numbers. Historians believe that some cords also recorded narratives, historical events, or genealogies. The knots could encode sequences that told a story, though the exact meaning of many patterns has been lost. The Spanish conquistadors who arrived in the 16th century saw the quipus as pagan tools and destroyed thousands of them. They replaced the system with European writing and accounting, assuming the knotted cords were primitive. But they were wrong. The quipu was a sophisticated information technology, one that allowed an empire without a written language to function with extraordinary precision. Today, only a few hundred quipus survive, preserved in museums and dusty archives. Researchers still struggle to read them because the key to the code died with the last trained quipucamayos centuries ago. But every new discovery hints at a world where information was stored not in ink, but in the twist of a fiber. A single quipu could hold more information than a written page. And yet, to the untrained eye, it looked like nothing more than a tangled bundle of colored strings. But to the quipucamayos, the trained knot keepers of the Inca Empire, every hue and every twist was a precise symbol. A yellow cord might represent gold or maize, while a red one signified soldiers or blood. A simple overhand knot stood for 1, a figure 8 knot for 10, and a complex series of loops could encode hundreds or even thousands. The space between knots also carried meaning, telling the reader where one number ended and another began. This was not a crude memory aid. It was a sophisticated recording system that allowed the Inca to track the census of every village, the tax owed by every province, and the supplies stored in every way station along the imperial roads. When a provincial governor needed to report his harvest, he summoned the local Quipu, who tied the data into a cord. That cord then traveled by relay runners along the vast network of stone highways that crossed the Andes. At the capital in Cusco, Master Quipu gathered the incoming cords and compiled a master record for the emperor. They could tell him exactly how many llamas grazed in the highlands, how many bushels of potatoes filled the storehouses, and how many men were available for military service. The Quipu was the central nervous system of the Inca bureaucracy. It enabled the state to manage a territory that stretched from modern Colombia to Chile, across deserts, mountains, and jungles without a single written word. The network of royal storehouses, spaced a day's march apart along the roads, held enough grain and dried meat to supply an army on the move. The Quipu kept the inventories, updating the cords as supplies were issued. When a new road was built or a bridge repaired, the labor quotas were recorded on quipus and sent to the villages. The entire system functioned with a precision that astonished the Spanish conquistadors, who immediately destroyed thousands of quipus, dismissing them as pagan objects. But those cords were not primitive. They were the product of centuries of refinement, a language of knots that encoded not only numbers but possibly even narratives, genealogies, and historical events. Only a few hundred quipus survive today, preserved in museums and private collections, and the key to fully reading them died with the last trained Quipu in the 16th century. Modern researchers are still struggling to decode the patterns, using computer analysis and comparison with colonial records. Each new discovery reveals a layer of complexity that earlier scholars never imagined. The Quipu was not a simple mnemonic device. It was a true information technology, one that allowed an empire without writing to rival any literate civilization in its administrative reach. What secrets remain hidden in those twisted fibers? That question still haunts archaeologists today, a reminder that the forgotten bureaucracies of the past did not always leave behind clay tablets or papyrus scrolls. Sometimes they left a collection of knots waiting for someone who can still read them. The cords of the Quipu could track grain and soldiers, but the Inca Empire ran on something far more personal: human labor. This was not slavery in the way we often imagine. It was a state-organized system of mandatory public service called the Mita, a Quechua word meaning to take a turn or to share a burden. Every able-bodied adult in the empire owed a certain number of days each year to work for the state. They could be called to build roads, construct temples, weave cloth for the army, or even serve as runners carrying quipus along the mountain trails. The Mita was a tax paid in effort, not in coins or grain, and it was the bureaucratic glue that held the Inca world together. The system worked because the Inca had an extraordinarily detailed census. The Quipu recorded every household, every man and woman of working age, and the specific skills they possessed. A village of weavers would be noted for their textiles. A community of stonemasons would be flagged for construction projects. When the state needed a new bridge across a gorge or a terrace system carved into a hillside, the bureaucrats in Cusco consulted the quipus. They calculated how many workers were needed, how long the project would take, and which villages would supply the labor. Then they sent the orders back along the roads, carried by runners who memorized or carried the knotted instructions. The local Curoca, a village headman who served as a middleman between the people and the empire, would read the Quipu and assemble his workers. The Mita was not arbitrary. It followed a strict rotation. Each family knew when their turn would come. They would leave their farms in the care of relatives and travel to the worksite, often carrying their own food and tools. The state provided rations during the work period, drawn from the vast storehouses that dotted the landscape. Those storehouses were themselves stocked by the Mita, with farmers delivering a portion of their harvest as another form of tax. The entire economy was a cycle of labor and goods, all recorded in the language of knots. A man might spend 3 months building a road in a distant valley, then return home to find his own fields had been tended by neighbors fulfilling a different mita obligation. It was a system of reciprocal duty enforced by the state but woven into the fabric of community life. The scale of these projects was staggering. The Inca road network stretched over 25,000 miles, crossing high passes and suspension bridges that swayed over deep canyons. Every stone of those roads was set by Mita labor. The terraced fields that turned steep mountainsides into farmland, the irrigation canals that carried water across dry valleys, the royal palaces and temples of Cusco, all were built by workers who took their turn in the Great Rotation. Even the immense fortress of Sacsayhuaman, with its massive stones fitted together without mortar, was a product of this system. The bureaucracy behind it was invisible to the workers themselves. They simply showed up, worked their allotted days, and returned home. It was the Quipu and the imperial administrators who transformed sweat into a resource as measurable as gold. But the Mita was not without its burdens. For communities far from the capital, the journey to a worksite could take weeks, cutting into the time available for their own harvests. The state tried to mitigate this by scheduling projects during the agricultural off-season, but the system was always a strain. Some villages were assigned to particularly grueling tasks, such as mining for silver or coca leaf production, which could be dangerous and unpleasant. The Inca state offered rewards for exceptional service, such as gifts of cloth or extra rations, but the core obligation was compulsory. It was a tax on time and energy, and it required constant oversight to prevent abuse. The local Curaca had to balance the demands of the empire with the well-being of his people, a delicate act of bureaucratic juggling. The Mita system outlived the Inca Empire itself. When the Spanish conquistadors seized control, they recognized its efficiency and adapted it for their own purposes. They forced native communities to work in silver mines under brutal conditions, twisting the Mita into a tool of colonial exploitation. The original Inca system, while demanding, had been embedded in a web of mutual obligation and state-provided support. The Spanish stripped away the reciprocity, leaving only the compulsion. The scars of that transformation lasted for centuries. Today, when we look at the ruins of Inca roads and terraces, we are seeing the physical imprint of a bureaucratic masterpiece. Every stone was placed by someone who owed a debt of labor to the empire, a debt recorded on a knotted cord and remembered by a village headman. The Mita was not just a tax. It was the pulse of the Inca state, a rhythm of work and duty that kept the mountain empire alive. And when the knots of the Quipus could no longer be read, that pulse fell silent, leaving behind only the silent stones and the question of what it meant to turn labor into a language of governance. The Mita was more than a tax. It was a pact between the state and every household. When the Inca emperor needed a road carved into a cliff face or a temple raised on a hillside, he did not reach into a treasury filled with gold coins. He reached into a register of names. Every able adult in the empire owed a set number of days each year to the state. This was not a payment in silver or grain. It was a payment in sweat, in muscle, in time. The quantity and timing of that obligation were determined by the Quipu, the knot keepers, who consulted the colored cords to see how many workers a village could spare and when their fields would be fallow. No one was exempt. A farmer, a weaver, a stonemason all took their turn. The system was built on a simple principle. The empire provided stability, roads, irrigation, and protection. In return, the people provided labor. This was a deeply personal transaction. You could see the result of your tax in the stone beneath your feet, in the bridge that carried your llamas across a gorge, in the terraces that stopped your hillside from washing away in the rain. The key to making this work was the Curaca. The Kuraka was a local chief, usually from a hereditary line of village leaders, who served as the bridge between the imperial bureaucracy and the ordinary farmer. He knew who was old and who was young, who was sick and who was strong. The Quipu in Cusco might send an order demanding 50 workers for 3 months to repair a section of the royal road. The Kuraka then consulted his own local records, remembered on smaller quipus or passed down by word of mouth, and decided which families would send a member. He balanced the burden carefully. A household that had sent a worker last season might be skipped this time. A family with many sons might contribute more often than one with only a single adult. The Kuraka was also responsible for ensuring that the workers took their tools and food with them, and for reporting any who tried to flee their obligation. He was the face of the state, the one who knocked on your door and told you it was your turn. And because he lived among the people he supervised, he had a powerful incentive to be fair. A Kuraka who showed favoritism could face resentment or worse, a report to the imperial inspector who occasionally toured the provinces with his own quipu. The Mita system was not a burden that fell equally on every individual. It was a burden that rotated through the community so that no single family was crippled. When a man left for his turn, his neighbors often helped tend his fields, a reciprocal arrangement that predated the Inca and was woven into the Mita itself. The state also provided rations during the work period, drawn from the vast storehouses that dotted the Andean landscape. These storehouses, called kulkas, were themselves stocked by the Mita. Farmers delivered a portion of their harvest as a separate form of tax, and the grain was stored for exactly this purpose. So when a man walked days to a construction site, he knew that food would be waiting for him. He would not starve while he worked. The system was circular. Your labor built the road, and the road allowed the grain to reach the storehouse that fed you when you built the next road. This stands in sharp contrast to monetary taxation, which is how most empires collected revenue. In ancient Rome, you paid a percentage of your harvest in silver or grain. In Han China, you paid in coins or bolts of silk. The Inca had no coinage at all. There was no universal currency, no market where a farmer could sell his surplus and then hand over a portion of the profit. Instead, the state claimed your time directly. This eliminated the need for complex financial accounting. There was no worry about inflation, no problem of counterfeit coins, no need to transport heavy chests of silver across mountain passes. The tax was already where it needed to be, in the bodies of the workers. The state simply redirected their effort toward projects that served the whole empire. The system was efficient for a reason. It solved the logistical nightmare of managing a vast territory without writing and without money. Consider what this meant for a village in the highlands. Your community owed a certain number of workdays per year. The Kuraka told you when your turn arrived. You walked to the worksite, often a day's journey away. You labored for weeks hauling stones or digging canals. You ate from the state storehouses. You slept in temporary shelters built for the season. Then you returned home and your obligation was fulfilled. The local quipu was updated. The knot was tied to show that your household had paid its debt. The system was predictable, which made it tolerable. Everyone knew the rules, and everyone knew that their neighbors played by the same rules. The Mita did not feel like arbitrary exploitation. It felt like a duty, a role you played in the life of the empire. And the empire, in turn, gave you roads that connected you to other valleys, a system of justice that settled disputes, and a confidence that when your own fields needed an extra hand during harvest, someone else would come to help because their Mita would bring them. The true genius of the Mita was that it turned human energy into a manageable resource. The imperial bureaucrats in Cusco did not have to guess how many workers were available. They knew exactly how many able adults lived in each province because the quipus told them. They knew when the harvest would end and when the workers would be free because the agricultural calendar was fixed. They planned projects years in advance, calculating the total labor required, and then distributing the demand across the provinces according to their population. This was not guesswork, it was a precise science of human allocation. The roads, the terraces, the temples, the fortresses, they all rose from this foundation of organized effort. The stones of Machu Picchu were set by Mita workers. The suspension bridges that swayed over raging rivers were woven and anchored by Mita workers. The entire infrastructure of the largest empire in the pre-Columbian Americas was built not with gold, but with the steady rhythm of a million hands taking their turn. The Mita was the heartbeat of the Inca world, and when the Spanish arrived, they did not abolish it. They simply changed whose hands were forced to work. Far across the ocean, in the Valley of Mexico, another empire organized its people through a system that began at the neighborhood level. The Aztec capital of Tenochtitlan rose from an island in a salt lake, a city of 200,000 people packed onto a grid of canals and causeways. Managing such a dense urban population required a structure that reached every household, and that structure was the calpulli. A calpulli was not just a neighborhood. It was a self-governing community, a unit of land, identity, and obligation that predated the Aztec Empire itself. Each calpulli had its own temple, its own school for young men, and its own market square. The people who lived there often shared a common ancestry or trade. One calpulli might be filled with fishermen, another with feather workers, a third with farmers who worked the chinampas, the floating gardens that fed the city. The calpulli owned the land collectively. Families did not own individual plots outright. Instead, they received the right to farm a parcel, and that right passed down through generations as long as the family fulfilled its duties. Those duties were recorded by a local official called the calpulec, a leader chosen from within the community. The calpulec was the bureaucrat of the neighborhood. He maintained a register of every household, tracking births, deaths, marriages, and the amount of land each family worked. He collected tribute in the form of maize, beans, cotton, or craft goods, depending on what the calpulli produced. He organized the labor drafts that built and maintained the city's canals, causeways, and temples, and he ensured that every young man received military training at the local school, because every able-bodied man was expected to serve in the Aztec army when called. The calpulec reported to a higher official in the imperial bureaucracy, a tax collector or a military commander, but he was not an outsider imposed by the emperor. He was one of the community, known to every family, someone who could settle a boundary dispute between neighbors without needing to send a message to the distant palace. This local knowledge made the system efficient. The emperor in Tenochtitlan did not need to know the name of every farmer. He only needed to know that a certain calpulli owed a certain amount of tribute each year. The calpulec made sure the quota was met. The records of these obligations were kept in painted codices, books made of folded deer skin or bark paper, where scribes used colorful pictograms to record quantities, dates, and the names of officials. Like the Inca Quipus, these codices were a form of administrative technology, a way to track the flow of goods and labor across a vast empire without a phonetic writing system. The calpulli system also served as a safety net. If a family fell on hard times because of illness or a poor harvest, the calpulli as a whole would step in to help. The land would not be taken away. The community had a stake in keeping every household viable, because a weakened calpulli meant less tribute and less labor for the empire. This mutual responsibility created a strong sense of identity. A person from the calpulli of Moyotlan felt a deeper loyalty to his neighborhood than to the abstract idea of the Aztec Empire. The emperor was a distant figure. The calpulec was a neighbor who knew your father. This layered system of governance, from the household to the calpulli to the district to the city to the empire, allowed the Aztecs to build one of the largest urban centers in the pre-industrial world without the kind of centralized bureaucracy that the Romans or Chinese relied on. The power was distributed downward, embedded in the daily life of every neighborhood. When the Spanish arrived and besieged Tenochtitlan, they were shocked by the order they found. The city was clean, the canals were lined with gardens, and every corner of the market was meticulously organized. That order came from the calpulli, from the quiet work of 1,000 neighborhood leaders who kept their small piece of the empire running. And even after the conquest, the calpulli structure did not vanish entirely. It adapted, and in some parts of Mexico, its echoes can still be felt in the way rural communities organize themselves today. At the heart of Aztec society lay the calpulli, a unit that blended family, land, and duty into one cohesive whole. It was not a mere neighborhood defined by streets and houses. It was a self-governing community with its own identity, its own temple, its own market, and its own school for training young men. The calpulli owned the land collectively. Families did not purchase or inherit private property. Instead, they received the right to farm a specific plot, and that right passed down through generations as long as the family continued to fulfill its obligations to the community. Those obligations were many. Every calpulli owed a fixed amount of tribute to the imperial capital: maize, beans, cotton, or crafted goods, depending on what the land and the people produced best. They also owed labor, sending workers to build and maintain the great causeways, canals, and temples of Tenochtitlan. The person who managed all of this at the local level was the calpulli. He was a leader chosen from within the community, not a distant official imposed by the emperor. He knew every family by name, knew which fields were producing well and which households were struggling. He kept a painted record of births, deaths, marriages, and land assignments, a simple but effective census that allowed the imperial bureaucracy to trust that each calpulli would meet its quota. When a young man reached adolescence, he entered the local tulpochkali, the house of youth, where he learned the basics of warfare, discipline, and craft. The school was attached to the calpulli's temple, and the teachers were veteran warriors from the same community. This meant that every boy received a practical education rooted in the values of his own neighborhood. He learned loyalty to his calpulli first and loyalty to the empire second. That order was intentional. The Aztec state understood that strong local communities made a strong empire. The calpulli also served as a court for minor disputes. If two farmers argued over a boundary or a merchant accused a neighbor of theft, the calpulli and a council of elders would hear the case. They could impose fines, order reparations, or assign extra labor as punishment. Most conflicts were resolved within the calpulli, never reaching the higher courts of the imperial capital. This decentralized justice system prevented the emperor from being overwhelmed by petty cases and allowed communities to maintain their own sense of order. The genius of the calpulli system lay in its flexibility. When the Triple Alliance conquered a new region, they did not force every village to adopt Aztec customs wholesale. Instead, they allowed the conquered people to keep their existing village structure as long as they accepted a calpulli appointed or approved by the empire and began paying tribute. Over time, these villages gradually absorbed Aztec practices, but the transition was smooth because the basic unit of governance, a self-managing community with collective land and local leadership, already existed in most of Mesoamerica. The Aztecs simply plugged their tribute demands into an existing framework. This is why the empire could expand so rapidly and hold together for nearly a century. It did not need a massive centralized bureaucracy sending inspectors to every village. It needed only to connect with the calpulli of each calpulli, and the rest of the community would follow. The calpulli also acted as a safety net. If a family suffered a bad harvest or lost its adult workers to illness, the calpulli would redistribute land or provide food from communal reserves. No one starved while others in the same calpulli had plenty. This mutual responsibility created a deep sense of belonging. A person from the calpulli of Quipu identified himself first by his neighborhood, then by his city, and only then as a subject of the emperor. The calpulli was not a distant figure. He lived on the same street, worshipped at the same temple, and sent his own sons to the same school. When the Spanish chroniclers arrived, they were struck by the order they saw in Tenochtitlan. The city of 200,000 people was clean, its canals lined with gardens, its markets bustling and organized. That order did not come from the imperial palace alone. It came from every calpulli, where a local leader and a council of elders quietly managed the daily business of land, tribute, and justice. The system bore a striking resemblance to a modern municipal government, with its local council, public schools, community works, and local courts. The calpulli was the original grassroots bureaucracy, a reminder that the most effective governance often begins not in a grand capital, but in the neighborhoods where people actually live. The salt caravan moved like a slow river of white crystals across the Sahara, 1,000 camels laden with slabs that would be traded for gold in the markets of Timbuktu. This trade route was the lifeblood of the Mali Empire, and managing it required a bureaucracy that stretched from the royal court to the distant desert oases. The Manses, the emperors of Mali, understood that their power rested not on conquest alone, but on controlling the flow of goods, information, and people. They built a system of administration that combined traditional village chiefs with a network of literate scribes who recorded every transaction in Arabic script. These scribes were often trained scholars from the famous University of Sankore in Timbuktu, where they studied grammar, law, and mathematics. They wrote tax receipts, trade agreements, and letters to distant rulers. Their work was essential because the Mali Empire spanned a vast territory of savanna and desert, where goods moved slowly and disputes could simmer for months without resolution. A merchant from the salt mines of Hattusa might travel weeks to sell his cargo in the markets of Niani, the imperial capital. He carried a written pass signed by a local governor, certifying that his goods had been taxed and that he had permission to trade. Without that document, his camels could be seized at the next checkpoint. The bureaucracy of Mali was not a heavy hand. It was a system of trust and record-keeping that allowed trade to flourish across ethnic and linguistic boundaries. The Manses appointed provincial governors called farbas, who collected tribute and maintained order. Below them were village chiefs who knew every family and every field. The farbas reported to the royal court through a chain of messengers who carried letters sealed with clay. The scribes were the invisible thread that connected the desert caravans to the palace, ensuring that taxes were paid, that trade routes remained open, and that the empire's legendary wealth flowed steadily toward the throne of Mansa Musa. Far across the Atlantic, a different kind of bureaucracy managed an empire of gold and salt. The Mali Empire, at its peak in the 14th century, was one of the wealthiest and most extensive kingdoms in the medieval world. Its rulers, especially the legendary Mansa Musa, presided over a territory that stretched from the Atlantic coast deep into the Sahara and across the savannah to the bend of the Niger River. This was not a realm held together by a single language or a shared religion. It was a mosaic of manned farmers, Tuareg nomads, Sonic merchants, and countless other communities, each with its own customs and leaders. To govern such diversity, the imperial court developed a bureaucracy that blended literacy with oral tradition, written records with living memory. At the center of this system were the Arabic-speaking scribes. These were learned men, often trained in the great centers of Islamic scholarship like Fez, Cairo, or the famous University of Sankore in Timbuktu. They wrote in flowing Arabic script on sheets of paper imported from North Africa, recording tax receipts, trade contracts, and diplomatic correspondence. When a caravan of salt arrived from the desert mines of Hattusa, the scribes noted the quantity, assessed the toll, and issued a receipt that the merchant carried to the next checkpoint. When Mansa Musa sent a letter to the Sultan of Egypt, a scribe composed the formal greetings and sealed the document with the imperial stamp. These written records gave the empire a kind of permanence. A dispute over a debt could be settled by consulting the archive. A trade agreement made years earlier could be verified by a surviving document. The scribes were the guardians of this paper memory, and their work made long-distance commerce possible across a region where trust was fragile and distances were vast. But writing was not the only form of record-keeping, nor was it the most trusted one. In manned society, there existed a parallel institution of knowledge that was far older than paper, the griot. A griot was a trained oral historian, a musician, a genealogist, and a living archive rolled into one. From childhood, a griot memorized the lineages of noble families, the terms of ancient treaties, the praise songs of past kings, and the laws that governed land ownership and marriage. This knowledge was passed down through generations, recited at ceremonies and royal courts, and treated with the same authority as a written document. When a new ruler ascended the throne, a griot would stand before the assembly and recount the deeds of his ancestors, legitimizing his rule by placing him within the chain of tradition. When a dispute arose between two villages over a boundary, the elders might summon a griot who remembered the original agreement made centuries before. The griot was not a mere entertainer. He was a living bureaucracy, a walking archive whose memory could be consulted when paper records were lost or ambiguous. The coexistence of scribes and griots gave the Mali Empire a remarkable resilience. If a document was destroyed by fire or moisture, the oral tradition could fill the gap. If a griot died without passing on his knowledge, the written record could preserve the information. The two systems reinforced each other, creating a web of accountability that stretched across the empire. The economic backbone of this whole structure was the trans-Saharan trade. Gold from the Bambuk and Bure fields, located in the forested regions to the south, was exchanged for salt from the Sahara, which was essential for preserving food and maintaining health. Other goods flowed along the same routes: copper, cloth, spices, ivory, and slaves. Managing this commerce required a bureaucratic apparatus that could track shipments, collect tolls, and resolve disputes between merchants from different regions. The imperial court appointed officials called farbas to govern the major provinces. A farba was a combination of governor, tax collector, and judge. He lived in a provincial capital, maintained a household of scribes and servants, and reported directly to the Mansa in Naini, the imperial capital. His duties included surveying the land, assessing the harvest, and ensuring that a portion of every trade caravan was paid to the treasury. He also settled local disputes and organized labor for public works, such as repairing roads or digging wells. The farba was the face of the empire in his region, and his effectiveness determined whether the province remained loyal or fell into rebellion. The most famous administrative achievement of the Mali Empire was the pilgrimage of Mansa Musa to Mecca in 1324. This was not a simple religious journey. It was a logistical operation of staggering proportions. The Mansa traveled with a retinue of tens of thousands of people, including soldiers, servants, scholars, and griots. He brought camels laden with gold dust, enough to flood the markets of Cairo and cause inflation that lasted for years. Every stage of the journey required planning. Food and water had to be secured at each stopping point. Local rulers had to be contacted in advance to ensure safe passage. The many camps had to be organized and supplied. This was bureaucracy in action on a grand scale, orchestrated by the same scribes and officials who managed the empire at home. The pilgrimage was not just a display of wealth. It was a demonstration of administrative competence, a signal to the world that the Mali Empire could move an army of pilgrims across thousands of miles without descending into chaos. The intellectual heart of this system was Timbuktu. This city, perched on the edge of the Sahara, was more than a market. It was a center of learning where scholars gathered from across the Islamic world. Its libraries held thousands of manuscripts on astronomy, medicine, law, and poetry. The city's scribes and judges were renowned for their learning, and its university attracted students from distant lands. The archives of Timbuktu preserved not only religious texts but also the administrative records of the empire, tax rolls, treaties, and letters between rulers. These documents were stored in private homes and family libraries, passed down through generations. They were the forgotten memory of the Mali Empire, a collection of paper that held the names of governors, the quantities of gold, and the terms of trade agreements. Many of these manuscripts survive today, hidden in the homes of Timbuktu's families, carefully preserved through centuries of turmoil. They are a reminder that the bureaucracy of the Mali Empire was not a distant abstraction. It was a living system of scribes, griots, and governors who managed one of the medieval world's great powers, and whose work can still be read in the faded ink of a 14th century page. A message could travel across Asia faster than any army had ever marched. The Mongol Empire at its height stretched from Korea to Hungary, covering over 24 million square kilometers. Holding that vast expanse together required more than swift horses and fierce warriors. It required a network of communication that could link the capital at Karakorum with the distant provinces in a matter of days, not weeks. The solution was the YAM system, a relay network of horse stations that became the nervous system of the Mongol world. Every 20 to 30 miles along the main routes, the Mongols built a station called a YAM. Each station kept a supply of fresh horses, fodder, and a small staff of riders and grooms. When a messenger arrived, he handed his pouch to a fresh rider who mounted a rested horse and galloped to the next station. The pouch never stopped moving. Rider after rider, horse after horse, the message flew across steppe, desert, and mountain pass. Official messengers carried a special tablet called a paser, a metal or wooden plaque inscribed with the emperor's orders. This paser guaranteed safe passage, food, and fresh horses at every YAM. A merchant or traveler without the tablet could not use the system. The YAM was reserved for state business, for military dispatches, tax reports, and diplomatic letters. It was a closed network of imperial communication, and it transformed how a nomadic empire could govern settled lands. The system was not unique to the Mongols. They adapted it from earlier Chinese and Turkic relay networks, but they scaled it to an unprecedented degree. At its peak, the Mongol YAM system included over 10,000 stations, each with up to 20 horses and a permanent staff. The stations were spaced so that a rider could cover 200 miles in a single day, a pace that would not be matched in Europe until the 19th century. Marco Polo, who traveled the Silk Road under the Mongol peace, described the YAM with awe in his writings. He noted that the couriers wore belts with bells that jingled as they rode, warning the next station to prepare a fresh horse. When the messenger arrived, he threw the pouch to the waiting rider without even dismounting. This speed meant that the Great Khan could receive news from a distant province and send a reply before a local rebellion could even organize. The YAM system also served as an intelligence network. The station masters were required to report any unusual movements of people or animals, any signs of unrest or natural disaster. The information flowed upward through a hierarchy of regional inspectors, all the way to the imperial court. This constant surveillance gave the Mongols a level of awareness that frightened their enemies. A Khan in Karakorum could know about a drought in Persia or a raid in Russia within the same season. The system was expensive to maintain. Each YAM required horses, grain, and salaries for the staff. The burden fell on the local populations who were required to provide supplies and labor. The Mongols levied a tax called the tamga to support the YAM, but local communities often resented the demands. When the empire fragmented in the 14th century, the YAM system decayed with it. Some stations were abandoned, others fell into disrepair. the roads that once hummed with the hoofbeats of imperial couriers grew silent. Yet the memory of that speed persisted. The yam system was a bureaucratic achievement that allowed a people who had no cities and no written laws to govern the largest contiguous land empire in history. It was a network of trust, speed, and organization that connected a world before the telegraph, and it remains a testament to the forgotten bureaucracies that made ancient empires function. Running the yam system required an army of overseers stationed across the empire. These officials were called Darughachi, and they served as the administrative backbone of Mongol rule in every conquered territory. When a new region fell under Mongol control, a Darughachi was appointed to oversee its integration into the imperial system. He was not a military commander. He was a bureaucrat with a seal. His primary duty was to collect taxes, maintain a census of the population, and ensure that the yam stations in his district were properly supplied with horses, grain, and personnel. The Darughachi reported directly to the imperial court, bypassing local rulers and nobles. This created a parallel chain of authority that kept real power in Mongol hands while allowing local leaders to retain their titles and ceremonies. The Darughachi maintained a permanent staff of scribes, translators, and accountants who kept records in Igha script, the administrative language of the empire. They tracked how many horses each yam station had, how much fodder was stored, and how many riders were available for duty. They also recorded the population of each village, the amount of grain harvested, and the number of livestock owned. Every piece of data was useful to the empire because the Mongols understood that knowledge was a form of control. The Darughachi worked closely with the local postal supervisors, known as Yamchin, who managed the daily operations of the relay stations. The Yamchin were responsible for keeping the horses healthy, the fodder dry, and the riders ready. They answered to the Darughachi, who inspected their stations regularly and punished any negligence. A yam station that failed to provide a fresh horse could delay an imperial dispatch by hours, a gap that could cost lives on a distant battlefield. So the Darughachi enforced standards with the same seriousness that a general enforced discipline in the army. The system was funded by a tax called the tamga, which was collected from the local population in goods or silver. The Darughachi set the rate based on the census data, calculated what each village could afford, and dispatched agents to collect the payment. The collected goods were stored in regional depots and used to supply the yam stations, the imperial court, and the military garrisons. This was not a system of random plunder. It was a calculated extraction of resources, managed by officials who knew exactly how much a province could produce. The Darughachi also served as judges in disputes between Mongol officials and local subjects, applying a hybrid legal code that blended Mongol customary law with the local traditions of the conquered people. Their decisions were recorded in writing, and copies were sent to the imperial capital for review. This created a written legal record that could be consulted in future disputes, giving the empire a sense of predictability and order that was rare in the medieval world. The system was not without its burdens. Local communities often resented the demands of the yam and the presence of foreign overseers, but the Darughachi were not simply exploiters. They were also the people who maintained the roads, repaired the bridges, and kept the peace. A well-run district under a competent Darughachi could experience decades of stability, with trade flowing freely and disputes resolved without violence. The Mongols, for all their reputation as conquerors, understood that an empire could not survive on fear alone. It needed administrators who could count, record, and enforce the rules. The Darughachi were those administrators, the quiet officials who turned the chaos of conquest into the order of empire. And in every province, from Persia to Siberia, they sat in their offices with stacks of paperwork, keeping the yam running, the taxes flowing, and the largest contiguous land empire in history connected by a thread of bureaucratic routine. The Song dynasty invented the world's first paper money. This was not an accident of commerce, but a deliberate act of bureaucratic genius born from a crisis of copper. For centuries, Chinese merchants had relied on strings of bronze coins, heavy and cumbersome, to conduct trade. A single large transaction could require cartloads of coins, each one a small disc of metal that clinked and weighed down the merchant's belt. By the 11th century, the Song economy had grown so rapidly that there was simply not enough copper to mint all the coins the market demanded. The state faced a choice: let trade stagnate or find a new medium of exchange. The bureaucrats of the Song treasury chose the latter, and in doing so, they launched a monetary revolution that would reshape the world. The first paper notes were not like modern banknotes. They were privately issued promissory notes, certificates of deposit that merchants could exchange at local shops for the equivalent value in coins. But soon the state saw an opportunity. If private merchants could issue paper notes that people trusted, why could the government not do the same? In the year 1024, the Song court established a special office, the Bureau of Exchange Notes, which began printing official paper currency. These notes were backed by a reserve of copper coins held in the treasury, and they could be used to pay taxes and buy goods from state-owned enterprises. The system worked because the bureaucracy could enforce it. Every note carried the seal of a regional commissioner, the date of issue, and a warning against counterfeiting, punishable by death. The state monopolies on salt, tea, and alum were the other pillar of Song fiscal power. Instead of taxing every transaction directly, the government took control of essential commodities. Salt was the most critical. It was a necessity of life, used to preserve food and maintain health. The Song state owned all salt production, from the coastal evaporation ponds to the inland brine wells. Private production was strictly forbidden. The government set the price, controlled the distribution, and collected the profit. This revenue, vast and predictable, funded the army, the civil service, and the massive public works that kept the empire running. The bureaucracy that managed this was immense. Provincial salt commissioners oversaw thousands of workers and hundreds of warehouses. They kept detailed ledgers of production, transport, and sales, and they sent regular reports to the capital. A single mistake in the accounts could lead to a shortfall in the treasury, so the commissioners hired teams of accountants to check every figure. The same model applied to tea, which was grown in the southern provinces and consumed across the empire. The state bought the entire harvest at a fixed price, then sold it through licensed merchants who paid a hefty fee. This guaranteed the government a steady income while controlling a commodity that was both a luxury and a daily staple. The tea monopoly required a separate bureaucracy of inspectors, tasters, and transporters, all trained to ensure that only government-stamped tea entered the market. Alum, a mineral used in dyeing and medicine, was also a state monopoly, along with incense and certain metals. These monopolies were not about efficiency. They were about control. The Song state understood that a steady flow of silver was less reliable than a steady flow of essential goods. By owning the means of production and distribution, the bureaucracy could predict its revenue with certainty, plan its budgets years in advance, and avoid the volatility of private markets. The paper money system and the state monopolies together created a fiscal machine that allowed the Song dynasty to field the largest standing army in the world, support a civil service of over 20,000 officials, and build a network of canals and roads that connected the empire. But this machine had a hidden flaw. The temptation to print more paper money than the reserves could cover was always there. When the treasury needed funds for a war or a flood relief, the bureaucrats could simply authorize a new batch of notes. Over time, inflation crept in, the notes lost value, the people began to hoard coins and distrust paper. The Song dynasty eventually fell to the Mongol invasion, but its fiscal innovations did not die. The paper money idea spread westward along the Silk Road, and the concept of state monopolies would later be refined by the Ming and Qing dynasties. In the tax offices of Hangzhou, where clerks once counted stacks of printed notes, the first seeds of modern monetary policy were quietly planted. Those clerks, whose names we will never know, were the forgotten architects of an idea that still shapes every wallet and bank account today. The fiscal bureau in Hangzhou processed more paper in a single month than most kingdoms saw in a year. The Song dynasty had created a financial administration so advanced that it would take Europe centuries to catch up. At the heart of this system was the jiaozi, the world's first government-issued paper money. Its invention was not a stroke of economic genius but a desperate response to a practical crisis. The empire simply did not have enough copper to mint all the coins its booming economy demanded. Merchants in Sichuan, a province far from the copper mines, had already started using private promissory notes for large transactions. The state observed this innovation and decided to take it over, standardizing the notes, backing them with a reserve of coins, and issuing them through a dedicated bureau. The jiaozi allowed a merchant to carry a fortune in his sleeve instead of loading a cart with heavy strings of bronze. But paper money only worked because the state could enforce its value. The central government established a complex system of reserves, setting aside a portion of the coin supply to guarantee every note issued. Regional commissioners were required to inspect the reserves regularly and report any shortfall. When inflation threatened because too many notes had been printed, the treasury would withdraw old notes from circulation, exchanging them for new ones at a fixed rate. This was not a perfect system. The temptation to overprint was always present, especially when the empire faced war or famine. Yet the Song bureaucrats managed inflation with a sophistication that would not be matched in Europe until the rise of central banks centuries later. Alongside paper money, the state relied on monopolies over essential goods to fill its coffers. Salt was the most lucrative. Every household needed it, and the state owned every salt pan, every evaporation pond, and every brine well in the empire. Private production was forbidden. The government set the price, controlled the distribution, and pocketed the profit. A vast network of salt commissioners, inspectors, and warehouse keepers stretched across the provinces. They tracked every grain of salt from production to sale, maintaining ledgers that recorded quantities, prices, and taxes paid. The tea monopoly worked on a similar principle. The state bought the entire harvest from the southern tea gardens at a fixed price, then sold it through licensed merchants who paid a heavy fee for the privilege. The revenue from tea alone funded a significant portion of the military budget. Alum, used in dyeing and medicine, was also a state monopoly, along with incense and certain metals. These monopolies gave the treasury a predictable and steady income that did not depend on the whims of private markets. A bad harvest might reduce the grain tax, but the salt and tea revenues remained stable because people still needed to eat and drink. All of this revenue flowed into a centralized fiscal system known as the Three Departments. The Department of State Affairs oversaw the overall budget. The Department of the Treasury managed the actual coins, notes, and goods. The Department of Revenue assessed taxes, set quotas, and audited the accounts of every province. These three bodies reported directly to the emperor and coordinated with each other through a constant flow of documents and inspectors. The system was designed to prevent any single official from controlling too much money or hiding a deficit. Every province sent quarterly reports detailing its income and expenditures. The central government compared these reports against its own records and sent out traveling auditors to verify the numbers. A prefect who misreported his accounts could be demoted or removed. This accountability allowed the Song state to collect taxes efficiently and to move funds from wealthy regions to poor ones, from peaceful provinces to frontier garrisons. The revenue from this fiscal machine funded the largest standing army in the medieval world, with over 1 million soldiers stationed along the northern borders. It also supported a civil service of more than 20,000 officials, each of whom drew a salary, received housing allowances, and often retired with a pension. This was an expensive undertaking. The payroll alone consumed a huge portion of the annual budget, but the Song emperors believed that a well-paid bureaucracy was a loyal bureaucracy. They were right, corruption was not eliminated, but it was kept in check by the constant threat of audit and the competitive pressure of the examination system. A magistrate who embezzled grain or pocketed tax silver risked not only his career but his life. The state had the resources to investigate and punish because the fiscal system generated enough surplus to fund the censors and the courts. The same officials who collected the taxes also managed trade. The Song bureaucracy regulated foreign commerce with a light but steady hand. It licensed private merchant ships, collected customs duties at ports, and even established state-run trading posts along the Silk Road. The revenues from international trade, though modest compared to the monopolies, added another stream of income. More importantly, the bureaucracy used trade to control the flow of precious metals into the empire. Copper and silver were essential for minting coins and backing paper money. The state encouraged imports of these metals by offering favorable exchange rates and restricting their export. This careful management of the money supply helped stabilize the value of the gyozhi and kept inflation from spiraling out of control for long periods. The Song financial administration was centuries ahead of its time. It used paper money, state monopolies, a centralized treasury, and a system of audits and reserves that would later be rediscovered by the banking houses of Renaissance Italy and the treasuries of early modern Europe. The officials who ran this system were not visionaries. They were practical men solving immediate problems: a shortage of copper, the need to feed an army, the challenge of governing a vast and diverse empire. But their solutions created a fiscal infrastructure that allowed the Song to thrive for over 3 centuries, to support a population of over 100 million, and to produce art, literature, and technology that still shape the world today. Those clerks in the Bureau of Exchange Notes, counting stacks of gyozhi and checking reserve levels, were the quiet architects of the first modern economy. They did not ride into battle or build great monuments. They sat at desks piled with paper, and in doing so, they invented the financial future. The Ottoman system solved the problem of loyalty by taking sons from Christian families and turning them into the Sultan's most trusted servants. This was the devshirme, a levy of young boys that served as the human foundation of the Ottoman bureaucracy. Every few years, officials traveled through the Balkan provinces and selected boys, usually between the ages of 8 and 18, based on intelligence and physical promise. They were taken from their families, brought to the capital, and converted to Islam. Then they entered a rigorous training program that lasted for years. They learned Turkish, Persian, and Arabic. They studied Islamic law, military tactics, and administrative procedure. They were taught to read, to write, and to calculate. The most talented among them were sent to the palace school, where they received an education that rivaled any in the world. The rest entered the Janissary Corps, the elite infantry units that formed the core of the Ottoman army. These young men had no family connections in the capital. They had no inherited wealth, no local power base, no loyalties to any noble house. Their entire identity was shaped by the state. They owed everything to the Sultan, and they knew it. This was not a system of oppression in the simple sense. It was a calculated investment in human capital, designed to produce a class of administrators and soldiers whose loyalty was absolute. The boys who rose through this system reached the highest offices in the empire. They became Grand Viziers, the Sultan's chief ministers, running the entire government. They commanded armies, governed provinces, and controlled the treasury. A man who had been taken from a village in Bosnia or Albania could end his career as the second most powerful person in the Ottoman world, all because he had passed through the devshirme and proven his ability. This created a bureaucracy that was remarkably meritocratic, at least within its narrow channel. Birth did not matter, family name did not matter. What mattered was performance, loyalty, and the ability to learn. The officials produced by this system were called the capiculu, meaning the slaves of the gate being the Sultan's palace. They were technically slaves, but their status bore little resemblance to the brutal chattel slavery of other times and places. They owned property, commanded armies, and wielded enormous influence. Their slavery was a legal fiction, a way of binding them completely to the ruler. A grand vizier who was a capiculu could be removed and executed without causing a political crisis among the noble families, because he had no noble family to protest. He was alone, dependent entirely on the Sultan's favor. This made him a perfect instrument of centralized power. The devshirme system ran for over 3 centuries, supplying the Ottoman state with a steady stream of capable administrators. It was a bureaucracy built not from paper or codes, but from human lives, deliberately shaped and placed into the machinery of empire. And when the system eventually declined in the 17th century, replaced by a hereditary elite that had learned to resist reform, the Ottoman state lost one of its most effective tools. The capiculu were forgotten, but their legacy lived on in the institutions they had built and the empire they had helped to hold together for so long. Every few years, Ottoman officials traveled the Balkan roads with a single purpose. They visited villages, surveyed the children, and selected the brightest and strongest boys from Christian families. These boys were taken to the capital, converted to Islam, and entered a system of training that would transform them into the empire's most loyal servants. The practice was called devshirme, a levy that provided the human foundation of the Ottoman bureaucracy. The boys who passed through this channel were not treated as slaves in the brutal sense. They were educated, housed, and groomed for power. They learned to read and write in multiple languages, studied Islamic law and administrative procedure, and trained in military tactics. The most gifted among them entered the palace school, where they received an education that rivaled any in the world. Others joined the Janissary Corps, the elite infantry units that formed the backbone of the Ottoman army. Their families were left behind, and with them any allegiance to local lords or bloodlines. The Sultan became their only patron, their only protector, their only source of advancement. This created a bureaucracy that was remarkably meritocratic within its narrow channel. A boy from a poor village in Albania could rise to become Grand Vizier, the second most powerful person in the empire, simply by proving his ability and loyalty. The Grand Vizier presided over the Imperial Council, known as the Divan, which met regularly to discuss matters of state. The Divan was the central decision-making body of the Ottoman government. It included the highest military commanders, the chief judges, and the finance ministers. But the daily work of administration fell to a dedicated corps of scribes and officials who recorded every decision and maintained the empire's archives. At the head of this scribble apparatus stood the Raisul Kutab, whose title literally means chief of the scribes. This official was responsible for the empire's diplomatic correspondence, the drafting of laws, and the preservation of official records. He managed a growing staff of clerks who produced documents on everything from tax assessments to treaties with foreign powers. Over time, the Raisul Kutab became one of the most influential figures in the Ottoman government, evolving into what we would recognize today as a foreign minister. The Divan met in a special hall within the Topkapi Palace, where the Grand Vizier sat on a raised cushion while the other officials stood or sat on benches according to their rank. The proceedings were recorded in detail, and the resulting documents were stored in the Imperial Archives, a vast collection of ledgers and scrolls that tracked the empire's resources and decisions for centuries. The entire system was designed to concentrate loyalty and expertise in the hands of men who owed everything to the Sultan. The provincial governors, called bailabis, were appointed from the same pool of trained officials. They ruled over vast territories, collected taxes, maintained order, and commanded local garrisons, but they knew that their position depended entirely on the sultan's favor. A single report of misconduct could strip them of their office and their life. This constant pressure kept the provincial administration responsive and deterred the kind of rebellious independence that had plagued earlier empires. The devshirme system produced generations of capable administrators who managed the Ottoman state at its peak. It was a bureaucracy built from human lives, deliberately shaped and placed into the machinery of power. And when the system eventually declined, replaced by a hereditary elite that resisted reform, the Ottoman state lost one of its most effective tools for maintaining control. But the legacy of those boys, taken from their homes and transformed into the architects of an empire, lingered in the institutions they had built and the archives they had filled with the written memory of the Sultan's will. After the Ottoman system perfected the art of turning outsiders into loyal administrators, another empire had already proven that fusing two cultures could create an even more resilient bureaucracy. When Alexander the Great conquered Egypt in 332 before the Common Era, he left behind a Greek general named Ptolemy to govern the province. Within a few years, Ptolemy declared himself pharaoh and founded a dynasty that would rule Egypt for nearly 3 centuries. The challenge he faced was immense. He needed to control a land with ancient traditions, a powerful priesthood, and a population that spoke a different language and worshipped different gods. His solution was not to replace the Egyptian system, but to layer a Greek administration on top of it, creating a hybrid bureaucracy that drew strength from both worlds. The result was one of the most efficient and well-documented governments of the ancient world. The Ptolemies kept the old Egyptian structure of nomes, the 42 provinces that had existed for thousands of years. Each nome still had a governor, a chief priest, and a local council, but above them, the Greeks placed a new set of officials drawn from the Hellenic elite. These were the strategoi, military governors who oversaw multiple nomes, and the oikonomoi, financial managers who tracked every tax payment and land lease. The key innovation was the creation of a central registry, the Basilican Grammateon, the Royal Secretariat. This office collected detailed reports from every nome on population, livestock, crop production, and irrigation works. The records were written on papyrus in Greek, using a standardized format that allowed the central government to compare data across the entire kingdom. A scribe in Alexandria could look at a roll from Upper Egypt and immediately know how much wheat that nome owed in taxes, how many laborers were available for canal maintenance, and whether the harvest had been good or poor. This level of information allowed the Ptolemies to plan with remarkable precision, directing grain surpluses to feed the capital and using tax relief to prevent unrest in struggling regions. The bureaucracy also innovated in land management. The Ptolemies divided the land into 3 categories: royal land, directly administered by the state; temple land, controlled by the priesthood; and private land, owned by individuals. Each category had its own tax rate and reporting requirements, and the scribes kept separate registers for each. A farmer on royal land paid a higher rent but also received state support for irrigation and seeds. This system required an army of inspectors who traveled the countryside measuring fields, counting livestock, and verifying harvest reports. They worked in pairs, a Greek and an Egyptian, both signing the final document so that no single official could falsify the record. The fusing of cultures went beyond paperwork. The Ptolemies presented themselves as traditional pharaohs, building temples to Egyptian gods and participating in religious ceremonies. But they also founded the Great Library of Alexandria and the Museum, a research institute that attracted scholars from across the Greek world. This dual identity allowed the Greek elite to rule without constant rebellion, because the Egyptian population saw the pharaoh as a legitimate successor to the old dynasties. The bureaucracy itself reflected this fusion. Upper-level officials were almost always Greek, speaking and writing in Greek, but the middle and lower ranks were filled by Egyptians who had learned the language and customs of their rulers. These bilingual scribes became the backbone of the administration, translating decrees into Demotic Egyptian for the local population and maintaining the flow of information between the palace and the villages. The Ptolemies also reformed the tax system with ruthless efficiency. They introduced a poll tax, a salt tax, a tax on trades, and a tax on temple incomes. Every transaction, from the sale of a donkey to the harvest of a vineyard, was recorded and taxed. The state even owned the papyrus swamps and the oil presses, leasing them to private operators for a fixed fee. The revenue from this system funded one of the most lavish courts in the Hellenistic world, including a standing army, a navy, and the construction of monumental buildings. Yet the same efficiency that made the Ptolemies rich also sowed the seeds of discontent. The heavy tax burden, combined with the visible wealth of the Greek elite, created a simmering resentment among the Egyptian population that would erupt in periodic revolts. The bureaucracy was a double-edged sword. It allowed the state to extract maximum resources, but it also made the state deeply unpopular when the extraction became too aggressive. The Ptolemaic system was not a perfect machine. It was a delicate balance between Greek innovation and Egyptian tradition, between central control and local autonomy. And when that balance tipped, the whole edifice began to crack. But for nearly 300 years, the bilingual scribes of the Nile kept the accounts, measured the fields, and collected the taxes, proving that a bureaucracy built on fusion could outlast the ambitions of any single ruler. Their work, recorded on thousands of papyrus fragments that still survive in the dry Egyptian sand, offers a window into a world where two ancient cultures merged into one administrative masterpiece. The Rosetta Stone is the most famous artifact of this bilingual administration, a decree carved in 3 scripts that allowed scholars to finally unlock the meaning of Egyptian hieroglyphs. But the stone was never meant for modern archaeologists. It was a routine piece of bureaucratic propaganda, a record of tax exemptions granted to the priesthood by a young pharaoh named Ptolemy V. The text was written in hieroglyphs for the Egyptian temples, in Demotic for the everyday administration, and in Greek for the ruling class. This triple inscription was not a favor to future linguists. It was a practical necessity. The Ptolemaic bureaucracy had to communicate with everyone, from the Greek governor in Alexandria to the Egyptian farmer in the Delta, and that required a corps of scribes who could move between languages as easily as between offices. At the head of this financial machine stood the Duoikites, the finance minister who oversaw the entire economic life of the kingdom. He was second only to the king in power, responsible for setting tax rates, managing the royal treasury, and supervising the vast network of inspectors and accountants who tracked every bushel of grain and every coin of silver. The Duoikites did not sit in a distant palace issuing vague orders. He received monthly reports from every nome, compiled by local scribes who measured fields, counted livestock, and recorded harvest yields. These reports were written on papyrus in Greek, but the data came from Egyptian village accountants who used traditional measures and local knowledge. The two systems had to be reconciled, and that reconciliation was the daily work of the bilingual scribe. Land registration was the backbone of this system. Every plot of land in Egypt was classified into categories: royal land directly administered by the state, temple land controlled by the priesthood, and private land owned by individuals or families. Each category had its own tax rate, its own reporting requirements, and its own set of officials. The scribes maintained registers that noted the size of each field, the type of crop planted, the expected yield, and the name of the cultivator. When a farmer inherited a plot, the transfer had to be recorded. When a field was flooded or left fallow, the tax was adjusted accordingly. This required a constant flow of paperwork, carried by boat along the Nile from village to provincial capital to Alexandria. The Duoikites used this information to plan the state budget. He knew exactly how much wheat each region would produce, how much could be exported to fund the army, and how much needed to be stored for emergencies. He calculated the taxes owed by each temple and each village, and he dispatched agents to collect the payments in kind or in silver. The system was so detailed that the state could predict a famine months in advance by comparing current harvest reports against the long-term averages stored in the archives. When a shortfall was detected, the Duoikites could order grain from a surplus region to be shipped to the deficit area, preventing unrest before it began. Trade was also tightly controlled. The Ptolemies owned the papyrus swamps, the oil presses, and the textile workshops. They licensed merchants to export grain, papyrus, and glass, and they collected customs duties at every port. The Duoikites set the prices for state monopolies, ensuring a steady profit for the treasury while preventing private traders from undercutting the royal revenues. All of this required an army of inspectors, warehouse keepers, and accountants, many of whom were Egyptians trained in Greek methods. The bureaucracy was not a foreign imposition but a partnership, with Greek officials providing the framework and Egyptian scribes providing the local knowledge. This fusion of traditions created a system that was both efficient and resilient. It survived rebellions, dynastic struggles, and the gradual decline of Ptolemaic power. And when the Romans finally annexed Egypt in 30 years before the Common Era, they did not dismantle the bureaucracy. They kept the nome system, the land registers, and the dual-language administration because it worked. The Romans understood that the best way to rule Egypt was to let the Egyptian scribes keep doing what they had done for centuries. The Rosetta Stone, once a routine tax decree, became a symbol of this long conversation between two cultures, a conversation written in stone and papyrus, in Greek and Egyptian, and preserved for 2,000 years in the dry sands of the Nile. In Carthage, the state was run not by kings but by two annually elected officials called suffetes, a word that simply means judges. These men were the highest magistrates of the republic, chosen from the wealthiest and most respected families. They presided over the Senate, commanded the army in times of war, and oversaw the vast commercial network that made Carthage the richest city in the western Mediterranean before Rome. But the suffetes did not rule alone. They worked alongside a council of elders, a popular assembly, and a complex system of specialized committees that managed everything from harbor fees to overseas colonies. The Carthaginian state was at its core a commercial administration. Its primary purpose was not to conquer territory or collect tribute from subject peoples, though it did both. Its primary purpose was to protect and expand trade. The entire bureaucracy was oriented toward that goal. The harbor of Carthage was a marvel of administrative design. It was divided into two connected basins, a rectangular outer harbor for merchant ships and a circular inner harbor for the navy. The outer harbor was lined with docks, warehouses, and offices where officials inspected cargo, collected customs duties, and issued permits. Every ship that entered paid a fee based on its size and the value of its goods. The records of these transactions were kept on papyrus or wax tablets, stored in the harbor archives for reference in case of disputes. The suffetes appointed a board of harbor commissioners who supervised this entire operation, setting rates, resolving conflicts, and ensuring that no merchant evaded the tolls. Carthage also maintained a network of commercial agents stationed in foreign ports from Spain to Sicily to the Levant. These agents were not diplomats in the modern sense. They were business representatives who negotiated contracts, monitored market conditions, and reported back to the Senate on political developments that might affect trade. They operated out of dedicated trading posts known as emporia, each with its own local administration. The Suffites received regular dispatches from these agents and used the information to adjust trade policies, set prices for state-controlled goods, and decide when to send out new expeditions. The famous Carthaginian explorer Hanno the Navigator, who led a fleet down the west coast of Africa around 500 years before the Common Era, was not acting on personal curiosity. He was following orders from the Senate, which wanted to establish new trading outposts and secure access to gold, ivory, and other resources. His voyage was a bureaucratic enterprise as much as an exploratory one, complete with scribes who recorded the locations of harbors, the customs of local peoples, and the goods available for trade. The administration of Carthage also managed the city's relationships with its subject territories in North Africa and the Mediterranean islands. These were not governed by a heavy-handed provincial system like the one the Romans later imposed. Instead, Carthage preferred to leave local institutions intact as long as the tribute arrived on time and the ports remained open. A local king or chieftain who cooperated could keep his throne. A governor appointed by the Suffites, often a younger son from a prominent Carthaginian family, oversaw the collection of taxes and the administration of justice. This light touch kept rebellions rare and reduced the cost of occupation. The commercial bureaucracy extended even to the religious sphere. The temples of Carthage were not just places of worship. They also functioned as banks and treasuries. The priests kept records of deposits made by merchants and nobles, and they lent money at interest. The Suffites sometimes borrowed from the temple treasuries to fund military campaigns or public works, and the loans were recorded with the same precision as any commercial transaction. This fusion of religion and finance was typical of Carthaginian administration, where the boundaries between sacred and secular were never rigid. The entire system was held together by a professional class of scribes and accountants, many of them trained in the use of the Phoenician alphabet, which was simpler and more efficient than cuneiform. These scribes produced contracts, tax receipts, and legal documents in a standardized format that could be understood across the Carthaginian world. When a merchant in Sicily signed a contract with a counterpart in Sardinia, both parties knew exactly what the terms meant because the scribes used the same formulas. This uniformity of documentation was a quiet but essential pillar of the Carthaginian economy. It allowed trade to flow across long distances with minimal friction, and it gave the Suffites the reliable data they needed to make decisions. The memory of Carthage was largely written by its enemies, especially the Romans who destroyed the city in the Third Punic War and scattered its archives. But the fragments that survive, along with references in Greek and Roman sources, reveal a state that was not a military empire in the conventional sense. It was a commercial republic administered by elected magistrates, managed by committees, and recorded by scribes, all working together to keep the silver flowing and the ships sailing. The Suffites were the faces of this system, but the true engine of Carthage was the bureaucracy of trade that surrounded them, a forgotten network of harbor officials, overseas agents, temple bankers, and ledger keepers who turned a Phoenician colony into the wealthiest city of the ancient Mediterranean. When the bonfires finally died down, the inner workings of that republic had turned to ash. The Roman soldiers who sacked Carthage in 146 before the Common Era had been given a grim order: leave nothing standing that could ever challenge Rome again. They pulled down walls, burned ships, and scattered the contents of the state archives into the flames. Those archives had contained centuries of commercial law, diplomatic treaties, tax records, and the correspondence of merchants who had traded from the coast of West Africa to the tin mines of Britain. All of it was lost, and with it, a detailed picture of how a commercial republic without a standing army had managed to dominate the Western Mediterranean for over 6 centuries. What little we know comes from the writings of Greek historians who visited Carthage before its fall, and from the scattered references in Roman texts that survived. From those fragments, we can reconstruct the outlines of a system that was remarkably modern in its design. At the top of the Carthaginian state stood two suffetes, elected annually by the citizens. These were not kings or hereditary rulers. They were magistrates who held power for a single year, much like the consuls of Rome, and they were accountable for their actions after leaving office. The suffetes presided over the Senate, a council of several hundred elders drawn from the wealthiest families, but the Senate did not micromanage the daily affairs of the state. That work fell to a network of specialized magistrates and committees, each responsible for a specific domain. There were magistrates in charge of the harbor, who supervised the docking, loading, and customs inspection of every ship that entered the great circular port. There were magistrates for public works, who maintained the city walls, the aqueducts, and the markets. There were magistrates for trade, who negotiated commercial agreements with foreign cities and oversaw the state-owned industries such as textile production and metalworking. And there were magistrates for the allied territories, who collected tribute from the Libyan and Numidian communities that supplied Carthage with grain, cattle, and soldiers. The entire system was held together by written contracts. The Carthaginians were among the most legally sophisticated people of the ancient world. Every commercial transaction, from the sale of a cargo of silver to the lease of a warehouse, was recorded in a standardized contract that specified the parties, the goods, the price, and the penalties for breach. These contracts were witnessed, sealed, and deposited in temple archives where they could be consulted in case of dispute. The state itself used contracts to manage its relationships with allies. When a Libyan chieftain pledged loyalty to Carthage, the terms of that pledge were written down: how much tribute he would pay, how many soldiers he would provide, and what he would receive in return, usually protection from rival tribes and access to Carthaginian markets. This system of written obligation allowed Carthage to build a network of allied territories that contributed resources without requiring a large, occupying army. The navy was the enforcement arm of this commercial bureaucracy. Carthage maintained the largest and most skilled fleet in the Western Mediterranean, with warships that could intercept pirates, escort merchant convoys, and blockade hostile ports. The navy was not a separate institution. It was another branch of the commercial administration, funded by harbor fees and customs duties, and commanded by magistrates who had risen through the ranks of the Harbor Commission. When a trading partner failed to honor a contract or a colony refused to pay its tribute, the fleet would appear off the coast, not to conquer, but to remind the offender of the costs of breaking an agreement. The threat was usually enough. Carthage preferred to avoid expensive wars that disrupted trade. It was cheaper to send a ship than an army. The archives that recorded all of this, the thousands of contracts, treaties, and financial ledgers, were deliberately destroyed by the Romans to ensure that Carthage could never rise again. But the loss went beyond the city itself. The Punic archives contained the accumulated knowledge of centuries of Mediterranean commerce, shipping routes, port depths, seasonal wind patterns, market prices for dozens of goods, and the legal precedents that governed international trade. The Romans had little interest in preserving this knowledge because they saw Carthage only as a rival to be eliminated. Yet the Roman legal system itself would later adopt many of the same principles of contract law that the Carthaginians had perfected. The influence of those lost archives reached across time, even if the documents themselves had turned to ash. What we would give today to read a single ledger from the harbor of Carthage, a list of ships arriving from Gades with a cargo of tin, or a contract between a Punic merchant and a Berber chieftain for a shipment of gold dust. Those records would tell us not only about the economy of an ancient republic, but about the forgotten bureaucrats who designed a system of commercial law that made long-distance trade possible without the backing of a massive army. They were the first to understand that trust, when recorded in writing and enforced by a reliable navy, could be more powerful than any legion. and their work, though burned and scattered, left an imprint on the Mediterranean world that never fully disappeared. On the highlands of Ethiopia, another empire stamped its authority onto metal. The Kingdom of Axum, which flourished from the 1st to the 7th century of the Common Era, minted coins that carried far more than a portrait of the king. They were bureaucratic instruments, tools of administration that projected power across a realm that stretched from the Nile to the Red Sea. The Axumite rulers understood that a coin was not just a medium of exchange. It was a portable decree, a tiny billboard that announced the king's name, his titles, and often a religious motto. A farmer in the highlands who handled a gold aureus knew exactly who ruled him. A merchant in the port of Adulis who received a silver coin in payment could read the king's claim to authority. This was not an afterthought. It was a deliberate policy of the Axumite treasury, which controlled the minting process with the same care that a scribe applied to a royal inscription. The coins were struck in 3 metals: gold for high-value trade with the Roman and Persian worlds, silver for regional commerce, and bronze for everyday exchanges in the markets of the capital. Each issue carried the king's image on one side and a symbol, often a cross after the conversion to Christianity, on the other. The inscriptions were in Greek, the lingua franca of international trade, ensuring that foreign merchants could identify the coin's origin and value. But the bureaucracy of Axum went beyond coinage. The kings also erected monumental inscriptions on stone stelae, carved in Ge'ez, the local script, and sometimes in Sabaean and Greek as well. The most famous of these is the Azana stone, which records the military campaigns and administrative reforms of King Azana in the 4th century. It lists the tribes he conquered, the lands he brought under tribute, and the gods he honored, first pagan and later Christian. These stelae were not just monuments to glory, they were public records carved in stone to be read by anyone who passed through the capital. They functioned as official announcements of state policy, tax obligations, and religious decrees. The same bureaucracy that produced the coins also produced the inscriptions, using the same script and the same standardized formulas. A king's name appeared the same way on a gold coin and on a granite slab. This consistency was a hallmark of Axumite administration. It allowed the state to project a unified identity across a diverse kingdom that included highland farmers, lowland nomads, and cosmopolitan port cities. The mint and the quarry were both branches of the same administrative machine, staffed by trained craftsmen who followed strict guidelines. We know this because the surviving coins show remarkably consistent weight and purity standards, a sign that the treasury carefully monitored the output. The inscriptions, too, share a formal structure of titles, lineage, and deeds, a bureaucratic template that evolved slowly over centuries. But the coins and stones were not merely tools of propaganda. They were also practical instruments of economic control. By issuing coins in standardized denominations, the Axumite state facilitated trade and tax collection. A merchant could trust that a gold coin from the king's mint had a fixed value because the state guaranteed its weight and purity. This trust reduced transaction costs and allowed long-distance trade to flourish. The port of Adulis became a hub where goods from Africa, Arabia, and the Mediterranean were exchanged using Axumite currency. The bureaucracy that managed this system, the mint officials, the treasury accountants, and the stone carvers, remain anonymous. But their work survives in the coins that still turn up in hordes from Yemen to Ethiopia, and in the stelae that still stand on the highlands, silent witnesses to an empire that used metal and stone to hold itself together. Today, when we hold an Axumite coin, we are holding a piece of bureaucratic history, a tiny object that once passed from hand to hand, carrying the weight of a kingdom's administrative will. On the highlands of Ethiopia, stone and metal carried the voice of a kingdom. The rulers of Axum understood that permanence required more than the spoken word. They carved their decrees into granite slabs and stamped their authority onto gold coins, creating a bureaucracy that projected power across the Red Sea and deep into the African interior. The Azana stone, a 4-foot-tall monument still standing in the ancient capital, records the military campaigns and administrative reforms of King Azana in 3 languages: Ge'ez, Sabaean, and Greek. This was not a simple boast. It was a public record, a carved announcement of tax obligations, tribute agreements, and religious decrees that could be read by any literate traveler passing through the city. Every detail was chosen with bureaucratic precision. The king's genealogy, the list of conquered peoples, and the formulaic praise of the gods followed a template that had been refined over generations. The stone was a legal document as much as a monument. The same impulse drove the minting of coins. Axum was one of the few ancient African kingdoms to issue its own currency in gold, silver, and bronze. Each coin carried the king's portrait, his titles, and often a religious motto, first pagan and later Christian after the conversion of Azana in the 4th century. These tiny objects were not just money, they were portable instruments of administration. A merchant trading in the port of Adulis could read on a gold aureus the name of the king who guaranteed its weight and purity. A farmer in the highlands handling a bronze piece knew exactly whose authority backed the transaction. The mint was a branch of the state treasury, staffed by skilled craftsmen who followed strict standards of weight and fineness. The survival of thousands of these coins, remarkably consistent over centuries, proves that the Axumite bureaucracy monitored the output with the same care that scribes applied to royal inscriptions. Beneath the king, who was called the Negus, a network of regional governors managed the provinces. These officials collected tribute in the form of gold, ivory, frankincense, and slaves, funneling the wealth toward the capital. They also oversaw the collection of customs duties at the port of Adulis, which was one of the busiest entrepôts of the ancient world, linking the markets of Rome, India, and Arabia. The bureaucracy of trade required scribes who could write in Greek, the lingua franca of commerce, and in Ge'ez for local records. They kept ledgers of incoming and outgoing cargo, tracked tax payments, and issued permits for ships to dock. The religious administration was equally organized. The Axumite state supported a hierarchy of priests and church officials, especially after Christianity became the official religion. The Negus appointed bishops and regulated the affairs of the growing church, using the same bureaucratic methods that managed the treasury. The entire system was designed to bind together a diverse kingdom of highland farmers, lowland nomads, and cosmopolitan port dwellers, all under the authority of a king whose name appeared on every coin and every stone. The scribes, the mint masters, and the governors remain anonymous, but their work created one of the most enduring states of late antiquity, a bridge between Africa and the ancient world that lasted for over 6 centuries. In Sparta, oversight came not from a king but from 5 elected officials. These men were the Ephors, a word that roughly means overseers or supervisors. Every year, the Spartan assembly chose 5 citizens over 30 years old to serve a single term. They could not be re-elected. This was a deliberate check on power, a bureaucratic invention designed to ensure that even the 2 hereditary kings of Sparta were held accountable to the state. The Ephors met daily in a dedicated building near the marketplace where they reviewed reports, heard disputes, and issued decrees. Their authority was vast. They could declare war, negotiate treaties, and even bring charges against a king for misconduct. When a king led an army on campaign, 2 Ephors accompanied him as observers, reporting back to the city on his decisions. They had the power to arrest a king if they believed he was acting against the interests of Sparta. This system of oversight was not a mere formality. It was a living, breathing bureaucracy of accountability that ran parallel to the military hierarchy. The Ephors did not command armies or lead troops. They watched, they listened, and they acted when necessary. Their most famous power was the ability to veto any decision made by the kings or the council of elders. This meant that no single individual could drive Sparta into a war or a treaty without the approval of the 5 Ephors. They also controlled the education system, the agoge, by appointing supervisors who ensured that every Spartan boy underwent the rigorous training expected of a citizen. They inspected the way magistrates performed their duties, called officials to account for their actions at the end of their terms, and even managed the calendar, setting the dates for festivals and military campaigns. The Ephors held office for only 1 year, which prevented them from building a personal power base. But during that year, they were arguably the most powerful individuals in the state because they sat in judgment over everyone, including the kings. Their meeting hall was said to contain the ivory chairs of the Ephors, seats that symbolized their authority. Any citizen could bring a complaint directly to an Ephor, who was required to hear it. This open-door policy gave ordinary Spartans a channel to challenge the powerful, a rare feature in ancient oligarchies. The Ephorate was a bureaucratic safeguard, a system of checks and balances embedded in a society that is often remembered only for its warriors. It kept the kings from becoming tyrants and the council from becoming a closed club. It turned oversight into an institution, a permanent office that existed to watch over the state and its leaders. And in a world where absolute power often corrupted absolutely, the Ephors were the quiet guardians of a fragile balance, a forgotten bureaucracy that helped Sparta survive for centuries as a unique and stable power. Their names are mostly lost, but their function echoes in every modern system of independent oversight, from independent prosecutors to ethics committees. A reminder that the most effective check on power is not a sword, but a set of eyes that never look away. Sparta's 5 Ephors held power that could stop a king in his tracks. Every autumn, the full assembly of Spartan citizens gathered in the open air to elect 5 men over the age of 30. Any citizen could stand for election, and the winners served a single, non-renewable term of 1 year. This was a radical departure from the hereditary monarchy and the aristocratic council that dominated most Greek city-states. In Athens, power flowed through the assembly and annually chosen generals, but no single body held such direct oversight over the highest officials. In Corinth or Thebes, oligarchies ruled without such checks. The Ephorate was uniquely Spartan, a mechanism designed to prevent the 2 hereditary kings from becoming tyrants and to keep the entire state machine accountable to the people. Their duties were as broad as they were intrusive. They sat in judgment over the kings, hearing disputes and even bringing criminal charges against a monarch who overstepped. When a king led an army on campaign, 2 Ephors accompanied him as silent observers, their presence a constant reminder that his decisions were watched. They could declare war, negotiate treaties, and decide the fate of prisoners. They oversaw the training of every Spartan boy, inspecting the agoge, the brutal education system that forged warriors, to ensure that no instructor had grown soft. They reviewed the accounts of magistrates at the end of their terms, punishing those who had embezzled or abused their power. They even controlled the calendar, setting the dates for religious festivals and military mobilizations. This concentration of authority in 5 annually rotating officials was unmatched in the Greek world. The Ephors held their meetings in a dedicated building near the marketplace, where any citizen could walk in and present a grievance. This open-door policy gave ordinary Spartans a direct line to the highest oversight body, a rare privilege in ancient oligarchies. If a man felt wronged by a king, a general, or a neighbor, he could speak to an Ephor and expect a hearing. The Ephors could issue decrees on the spot, ordering arrests, confiscations, or even the exile of a prominent figure. Their word was final, subject only to the assembly's approval in rare cases. This made them both admired and feared. Other Greek cities viewed the Ephorate as a strange and powerful invention, a check on authority that prevented Sparta from descending into the bloody cycles of tyranny and revolution that plagued so many of its neighbors. Yet within Sparta itself, the Ephors were often resented by the wealthy and the ambitious, who saw them as a barrier to their own influence. The institution was so effective that it outlasted the Spartan kings themselves. When the monarchy faded in the Hellenistic period, the ephorate remained, a testament to the idea that oversight is not a temporary measure but a permanent office. The Ephors were not philosophers or lawgivers. They were ordinary citizens selected by lot or vote who held power for a single year and then returned to private life. This rotation prevented the accumulation of personal power and kept the system responsive. It was a bureaucracy of accountability, a set of rules and offices designed to ensure that no one person, not even a king, could act without scrutiny. And it worked. Sparta remained stable for centuries while other Greek cities tore themselves apart with civil strife. The Ephors were the quiet guardians of that stability, their eyes always watching, their seals always ready to record a judgment. In a world where power corrupted, they were the five who never looked away. Beyond the mountains where Spartan Ephors watched over kings, another civilization took a completely different approach to order. It left behind no palaces, no royal tombs, and no monuments to any single ruler. What it did leave behind was a city designed with the precision of a blueprint. The Indus Valley Civilization, which flourished around 2,600 years before the Common Era in what is now Pakistan and northwest India, built cities that seemed to follow a single master plan written by an invisible hand. The streets of Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa ran in straight lines, intersecting at right angles to form a grid. The houses were made of standardized, oven-fired bricks that measured the same size whether you found them in the citadel or in the humblest workers' quarter. This uniformity was not accidental. It was the signature of a bureaucracy so thorough that it shaped the physical world around it. Every brick, every drain, every well followed a fixed standard that was enforced across hundreds of miles. The city planners did not leave behind a single written law code or a portrait of a king. Instead, they left behind the mute evidence of their system in the very layout of their cities. The drainage system of Mohenjo-Daro was more advanced than anything in the ancient world, with covered channels that carried waste away from every house and emptied into larger underground sewers. Building a system like that required coordination across entire neighborhoods. Someone had to decide where the channels would run, how steep the slope would be, and how often the drains would be cleaned. That someone was not a single autocrat but an organized body of officials who worked to a common standard. The weights used in the markets followed the same principle. Archaeologists have found tiny cubical stones, carefully polished and cut to precise ratios, that were used for weighing goods. These weights were uniform across the entire Indus region, from the coast to the foothills of the Himalayas. A merchant in one city could trust that a weight marked with a certain symbol meant the same thing in another city hundreds of miles away. This system of standardized measurement was the quiet infrastructure of a vast trade network that connected the Indus Valley to Mesopotamia and the Persian Gulf. The bricks, the drains, and the weights all point to a bureaucracy that valued consistency above all else. It did not need to write long decrees or carve boastful inscriptions. It expressed itself through the reliable shape of a brick and the predictable slope of a drain. The officials who enforced those standards remain nameless, but their work is still visible in the ruins, a testament to the power of a system that governed not through words but through the silent language of measurement and design. Thousands of bricks, each identical in size and shape, lie scattered across the ruins of an ancient civilization. From the citadel of Mohenjo-Daro to the distant outpost of Dolavira, these fired clay blocks measure the same length and width, a silent testimony to a standard enforced across hundreds of miles. This uniformity was not a coincidence. It was the work of an organized administration that dictated exactly how a brick should be made, how a street should be laid, and how a city should drain its wastewater. The Indus Valley Civilization, thriving over 4,000 years ago, left behind no royal palaces or monumental statues of kings. Instead, it left behind a landscape of planned urban centers, each following a template that spoke of a powerful bureaucracy operating behind the scenes. The drainage system alone reveals the level of coordination required. Every house in Mohenjo-Daro had its own bathroom and toilet, connected to covered brick channels that ran beneath the streets. These channels sloped gently to carry waste away from the living areas, and they were inspected and cleaned regularly. Maintaining such a network across a city of perhaps 40,000 people demanded a dedicated team of workers, supervisors, and inspectors. Someone had to decide where the main sewers would run, how often they would be flushed, and who would pay for the repairs. The same hands that standardized the bricks also standardized the urban plan. Streets intersected at right angles, dividing the city into neat blocks. Public wells were placed at regular intervals, ensuring every neighborhood had access to clean water. This was not organic growth. It was deliberate design, executed by an authority that could command resources and enforce compliance. Marketplaces across the Indus region used weights made of polished chert or jasper, cut into precise cubes with standardized ratios. The smallest weight weighed less than a gram, the largest over 10 kilograms. A merchant in Harappa could buy goods using a weight that meant the same thing in the port city of Lothal, over 500 miles away. This system of measurement allowed trade to flow smoothly without constant renegotiation of units. It also implies a central bureau that produced and distributed these weights, ensuring they matched the official standard. Officials likely traveled between cities, inspecting marketplaces and punishing those who used false measures. All of this activity, the planning, the inspection, the weight calibration, required a class of administrators who could read, write, and calculate. The Indus people developed a script that appears on hundreds of seals and pottery fragments, but despite over a century of study, the script remains undeciphered. We cannot read their tax records, their contracts, or their reports. The bureaucracy that built those cities is locked in symbols we cannot yet translate. Their names, their titles, and their daily routines are lost. What remains is the silent evidence of their work, the straight lines of streets, the even rows of bricks, and the polished stones that once balanced in the hands of a merchant. These objects speak of a forgotten system that organized one of the most extensive civilizations of the ancient world, a bureaucracy that left its signature in the shape of a drain and the weight of a stone. And until we learn to read their words, that signature is all we have. These forgotten bureaucracies teach us that the bones of an empire are not made of stone or steel, but of paper, of knots, of sealed clay, and of ledgers kept by nameless hands. Every system we explored, from the Sumerian scribe counting barley to the Inca Quipu twisting cords, shared a single truth: power cannot last without information. The Roman census, the Han examinations, the Byzantine logothetes, and the Ottoman devshirme all solved the same problem. They turned chaos into order by recording, inspecting, and accounting. They made the invisible visible. Without them, the grand narratives of history would have no stage on which to unfold. The battles, the monuments, the dynasties, all rested on the quiet work of officials who never sought glory. Their names are lost, but their methods echo in every modern government, every tax form, every census, every passport. When you file a report or swipe a card, you are touching the distant legacy of a scribe in Ur or a strategos in a Byzantine theme. The lesson is both humbling and hopeful. Greatness does not require a crown. It can be built with a stylus, a knotted cord, or a standardized brick. The forgotten bureaucracies remind us that the most enduring structures are not the ones that tower above us, but the ones that weave the fabric of daily life together, thread by thread, record by record. And somewhere in the dust of an unexcavated archive, another system waits to be rediscovered, its lessons still hidden, still waiting for someone to read the signs. Those signs are all around us, embedded in the very way we organize our own daily lives. Every time you fill out a form, wait for a permit, or check a receipt, you are touching the distant echo of a Sumerian clay tablet or a Roman census roll. The systems we uncovered in this journey are not ancient relics locked in a museum. They are living patterns that have shaped how power is managed, how resources are counted, and how trust is built across distance and time. From the knotted cords of the Inca to the sealed letters of the Hittite chancery, from the merit examinations of Han China to the rotating Ephors of Sparta, the details differed wildly, but the core ingredients remained the same. Every successful bureaucracy needed a way to record information, a method to hold officials accountable, and a structure that could survive the departure of a single leader. The Quipu, the satrapy, the calpulli, the devshirm, each was a unique answer to the same universal question. How do you make a large group of people work together without descending into chaos? The answer, discovered again and again by forgotten administrators, was not a charismatic king or a powerful army. It was a ledger, a seal, a standard weight, a written procedure. These quiet tools allowed empires to feed their cities, build their roads, and defend their borders long after the original conquerors had passed away. The people who wielded those tools rarely left their names in history books. They did not ride in chariots or stand atop monuments. They sat at desks, pressed reeds into clay, tied knots in cords, and stacked identical bricks. Their work was invisible, but it was the real foundation upon which every great civilization rested. The next time you hear a story about a famous emperor or a legendary battle, pause and wonder who kept the grain counts accurate so the army could march, or who recorded the treaty terms so the peace could hold. Those unsung individuals were the true engineers of history, and their legacy is still alive, not just in ruins and archives, but in the bureaucratic systems that surround you today. If this kind of deep dive into the overlooked mechanisms of the past sparks your curiosity, consider subscribing. More stories of hidden systems and forgotten architects are waiting to be unearthed, and the next one might change how you see the world.